Hey you. Yes, you the one who just got comfortable. Maybe you pulled the blanket a little tighter just now. Maybe you dimmed the light, or set your phone down somewhere close. And maybe, just maybe, tonight feels like one of those nights when sleep is close, but not quite there yet. Well, I am really glad you're here. Tonight I want to take you somewhere far away. Not to a war room, not to a battlefield, not to the kind of history that shouts at you from textbooks. Tonight I want to take you to something quieter, something that feels in the strangest way, almost familiar, a palace where children laughed and played in the snow, a city where the gas lamp still burned gold along the river, a family that sat down to dinner every evening and had absolutely no idea they were living inside the last chapter of their world. This is the story of Imperial Russia in her final quiet days, and if you have ever watched something beautiful slowly disappear without anyone quite realizing it in the moment, then this story is for you. Before we begin, if the atmosphere tonight feels right and you are finding yourself already drifting into this world with me, it would mean a great deal if you took just one small second to tap that like button or subscribe if you have not already. Leave a comment below, even just to say where you're watching from, or what time it is wherever you are right now. Are you in bed, on the couch? Is it raining outside your window? I genuinely love knowing these things. It makes this feel less like a recording, and more like a conversation between two people who both find history deeply, quietly beautiful. Now, get as comfortable as you possibly can. Let the room be soft. If you have a fan nearby, let it hum. And let tonight's story carry you somewhere else entirely. January 1917. The city of Petrograd, which most of the world still thought of as St. Petersburg, sat frozen along the banks of the Neva River, under a sky so heavy and grey it looked almost painted. The temperature had dropped to 40 degrees below zero that winter, 40 below. To put that in perspective, at that temperature, the moisture in your breath freezes before it fully leaves your mouth. Metal becomes brittle enough to shatter, and the cold does not just rest on your skin. It settles into your bones like something permanent. Petrograd in January of 1917 was a city that felt in every physical sense like it was being pressed down from above. And yet, if you had walked along Nevsky Prospect, the great main avenue of the city, wide enough to fit 8 carriages across on the evening of, say, January the 20th of that year, you might have thought everything was fine. You would have seen the gas lamps burning warm and golden in the dark. You would have heard the sound of a string quartet drifting from behind frosted glass. You would have passed a restaurant where men in evening coats raised their glasses to one another across candlelit tables. And for a moment, just a moment, you might have believed the old world was still intact. That is the thing about endings. They rarely look like endings from the inside. Now let me paint the full picture for you. Because Petrograd in early 1917 was not one city. It was 2 cities, pressed together, sharing the same streets, the same air, the same bitter cold. On one side, the Imperial City, the city of palaces and gilt-framed portraits, of servants in white gloves and ballrooms where the chandeliers held more candles than a small village would use in a month. The Winter Palace stood along the river, enormous pale green, the colour of sea foam, with 1,500 rooms inside its walls. 1,500. The Hermitage just next door housed artwork collected across 3 centuries. The bridges over the Neva were decorated with iron railings shaped like sea creatures, and on a clear morning when the frost turned the domes of St. Isaac's Cathedral silver, the whole city looked like something out of a fairy tale. But the fairy tale had a shadow. On the other side of Petrograd, not far at all from those beautiful gas lamps on Nevsky Prospect, were the factory districts. The Vyborg side, the Narva Gate quarter. Here the buildings were grey brick and packed so tightly together that sunlight rarely touched the ground between them. Families of 5 and 6 shared a single room. Children wore the same coat in February that they had worn in October, and the price of a basic loaf of bread. In 1914, when the war began, that loaf cost around 3 kopecks. By January of 1917 it had risen to over 12 kopecks and rising, and many days there simply was no bread to buy at all. The shop shelves were empty by dawn, lines formed in the dark. Women who had worked a full factory shift would stand in the cold for 2 or 3 hours, hoping. This is not a metaphor. This is what was actually happening in the city. In the same city where nobles were ordering champagne. Now here is the question that history keeps asking. How does a dynasty that has ruled for 304 years, that built one of the most magnificent cities in the world, that commanded an empire stretching across 11 time zones, how does that dynasty not see what is coming? The answer is more human than most people expect, and it starts with a train ride. Actually, it starts much earlier than that. It starts with a boy. A small, pale, fair-haired boy named Alexei. Alexei Nikolaevich Romanov was 12 years old in January of 1917. He was the only son of Tsar Nicholas II and the Empress Alexandra. He was by the rules of everything the empire had been built upon the future of Russia, and he was terribly ill. Alexei suffered from haemophilia, a condition in which the blood does not clot properly. A bruise that would heal in a week for any other child could for Alexei become a crisis that lasted for months. Internal bleeding that no one could see from the outside. Pain that no medicine of that era could fully address. His mother, the Empress Alexandra, had passed this condition to him without knowing. It travelled through her family line all the way back quietly to Queen Victoria of Britain, who was Alexandra's grandmother. The same illness had touched royal families across Europe. But in Russia, in the Romanov household, it became something else entirely. It became the invisible centre around which everything else quietly orbited. Because Alexandra was not simply a mother watching her child suffer. She was a mother who believed, with her whole heart, with something close to religious certainty, that there was one man on earth who could help her son. His name was Grigory Rasputin, and his name in January of 1917 was spoken in every corner of the empire, in drawing rooms, in army barracks, in workers' kitchens, with feelings ranging from awe to deep suspicion to absolute fury. Let me tell you something about Rasputin that most people get wrong. He was not as popular imagination tends to paint him a villain in a dark cloak whispering poison into royal ears. He was strange, certainly. He was uneducated, absolutely. He had a habit of showing up to aristocratic dinner parties smelling as though he had not bathed recently, eating with his hands and charming everyone in the room anyway. One of the more memorable accounts from that period comes from a French ambassador who dined near Rasputin, and described the experience as deeply unsettling, primarily because Rasputin kept staring at him throughout the meal without blinking. But here is the thing that the history books often skim past. When Alexei was in crisis, when the internal bleeding started, when the boy was pale and crying in pain, and the court doctors had no answers, Rasputin's presence genuinely seemed to help. The most accepted explanation today from medical historians is that Rasputin likely calmed the boy. A calm child, a relaxed child, a child whose anxiety is soothed by a firm, warm, confident presence. That child's blood pressure drops. The bleeding slows. In a cruel way, it was almost science. Just not the science anyone understood at the time. Alexandra understood only one thing. When Rasputin was near, her son did not suffer as badly. And that was enough. That was everything. So she kept him close. She trusted him. She allowed his voice into places it probably should not have gone. And while Nicholas was away at the front commanding an army he was not trained to command. In a war that had already taken over 1 million Russian lives by that point, Alexandra was in Petrograd, running the country with Rasputin's counsel. Now I want to be fair to Alexandra for a moment, because she is often made the villain of this story, and the truth is considerably more complicated. She was a deeply private woman. She had been raised in a small German court and Russian high society with all of its gossip and performance, and glittering cruelty never felt like home to her. She was genuinely devoted to her husband, genuinely devoted to her children. She was in the private world of the Alexander Palace at Tsarskoye Selo, About 15 miles south of Petrograd, tucked among birch trees and parks, a completely different person than her public image suggested. She knitted. She photographed her children constantly. She pressed flowers. She kept a journal with careful, neat handwriting recording the temperatures of her children on sick days, as if the numbers themselves might offer some protection. Alexandra was not a monster. She was a mother sealed inside a palace doing what made sense from inside that palace. But that palace was the problem. Because while she was pressing flowers and writing in her journal, the world outside that palace's gates was starving, exhausted, and slowly losing whatever faith it had left in the people who were supposed to be looking after it. Here is a detail that I find both beautiful and heartbreaking at the same time. In the winter of 1916 to 1917, that same brutal winter we've been talking about, the 5 Romanov children were photographed together one last time as a complete family at Tsarskoye Selo. Olga was 21, Tatiana was 19, Maria was 17, Anastasia was 15, and little Alexei, the pale boy with the kind eyes, was 12. In the photographs they look ordinary, not imperial, not mythological, just young. Olga has a slightly tired look around her eyes. She'd been working as a nurse in a military hospital, and she'd seen things no 21-year-old should have to see. Tatiana looks composed, careful as she always did. She was the organized one, the one who kept lists and made sure things ran smoothly. Maria is smiling at something off to the side. Anastasia, famously mischievous, famously funny, apparently once described by a court tutor as a small tornado in human form, looks like she's about 2 seconds away from saying something that will make everyone laugh. And Alexei is looking directly at the camera, calm, still, with an expression that is hard to describe but easy to feel. That photograph was taken in the last quiet autumn before everything fell apart. But let us return to the cold, because the cold is where the story truly lives. January 1917. In the factory districts of Petrograd, something had begun to shift. The workers at the Putilov plant, the largest industrial factory in the city employing roughly 30,000 people, had been growing louder for months. Strikes had risen sharply across the previous 2 years. In 1915, there had been around 55,000 strikes across Russia. By 1916, that number had nearly doubled, and the winter of 1916 to 1917 was by recorded accounts exceptionally cold, even by Russian standards. One document from that period described Petrograd in January as being huddled against the frozen Neva, struggling under hunger fuel shortages and a weariness that had moved past exhaustion into something closer to quiet grief. The government knew. There are documents that prove the government knew. A secret police report from October of 1916, just 3 months before everything collapsed, described the city as being, in the officer's own words, on the eve of great events, with which those of 1905 were mere child's play. And the British ambassador to Russia, Sir George Buchanan, had personally warned the Tsar, personally to his face, that if Nicholas continued down the same path a revolution was, in the ambassador's careful diplomatic phrasing, I fear inevitable. Nicholas thanked him, and changed nothing. This is the part of the story that I keep returning to. Not the betrayal, not the violence that came later, but this, the quiet. The way a man who was by all accounts gentle and kind and devoted to his family could sit inside that quiet and simply not hear the sound of the world outside the window. There is a word in Russian avos that has no perfect English translation. It means something like, perhaps it will work out, a kind of hopeful shrug at fate. Maybe Nicholas had avos. Maybe he believed somewhere deep and unexamined that the 304 years of Romanov rule that had come before him were a kind of guarantee, that the sheer weight of history would hold. It is not so different from the way many of us think about the things in our own lives that feel permanent, the things we cannot quite imagine losing. And maybe that is why this story more than 100 years later still lands somewhere tender, because we recognize it. Not the palaces, not the empire, but the feeling of standing inside something precious, while the cracks quietly spread, and finding it nearly impossible to believe that anything this familiar could ever truly end. Outside the windows of Tsarskoye Selo that January, the birch trees stood bare and frost-covered in the dark. The gas lamps burned low. Inside the palace, Alexandra sat near her writing desk and composed another letter to Nicholas at the front. She wrote to him almost every day. He wrote back almost every day. Their letters preserved in full and read by historians for the past century are remarkable things. They are full of tenderness, full of small domestic details, how the children were feeling, what they had eaten, whether Alexei had slept well. In one letter from this period, Nicholas writes simply, "I miss you terribly, and I think about you all day long." That is not the sentence of an emperor. That is the sentence of a husband who misses his family. And it makes everything that came after feel not like the fall of a dynasty, but like the loss of something quieter, something private, something that should have been allowed to simply live. But history, of course, was not finished with them yet, because somewhere in Petrograd on those same cold January streets the women were already starting to talk. And in just a few weeks they would do far more than talk. Stay close, because the story of how an empire's final quiet days gave way to something far louder begins not with a gunshot, not with a decree, not with any powerful man making any powerful decision. It begins with women standing in a bread line before dawn. And that story is coming right now. So you are still here. Good. There is something I find quietly remarkable about the fact that you chose to stay, to keep listening, to let this particular corner of history wrap itself around you like something warm. And I want to honour that by giving you a story worth holding on to. Because what comes next is, in my opinion, one of the most quietly devastating character studies in all of modern history. Not a monster, not a villain, not the cold-blooded autocrat that certain textbooks like to paint in broad strokes. Just a man, a deeply ordinary man, who happened to be born into the most extraordinary and most crushing set of circumstances imaginable. His name was Nicholas Alexandrovich Romanov, and before he was ever the Tsar of all the Russias, he was just Nicky. There is a sentence, a real sentence spoken by a real 26-year-old man that I keep returning to every time I think about this story. Nicholas said it in the autumn of 1894, the day his father died, and the weight of the entire Russian Empire fell without warning onto his shoulders. He turned to a cousin and said in something close to panic, "What is going to happen to me and to all of Russia? I am not prepared to be a Tsar. I never wanted to become one. I know nothing of the business of ruling. I have no idea of even how to talk to the ministers." Read that again slowly. A man who controls 1/6 of the Earth's land surface, who commands millions of soldiers, who holds the fate of 125 million people in his hands, has just admitted out loud that he has no idea what he is doing. That is not fiction. That is from his own documented words. And here is what I find so striking about it. Most powerful people, when they sense weakness in themselves, reach for the mask. They perform confidence. They straighten their backs and learn the language of certainty. Nicholas never quite managed that, and Russia, for better and for worse, paid a very long price for it. Let me take you back even further. Before the throne, before the crown, before any of it. Nicholas was born in the spring of 1868, the eldest son of Tsar Alexander III, a man who was in every way that Nicholas was not built for power. Alexander III was physically enormous. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with arms reportedly strong enough to bend iron pokers with his bare hands. He was blunt, decisive, and utterly terrifying to foreign diplomats who met him. He'd been known to straighten bent coins between his fingers at dinner parties. Whether that last story is entirely true, I honestly cannot say with certainty. But even the fact that people believed it and passed it along tells you something about the kind of presence Alexander projected. Nicholas, by contrast, was slight. He was described by those who knew him as pleasant, charming, gentle-mannered, with the kind of warm, easy smile that made people feel immediately at ease. He spoke fluent English. In fact, he and Alexandra communicated in English, even in their most private letters. He spoke French and German as well. He had a genuinely phenomenal memory. He could recall the names, faces and service records of hundreds of soldiers he had met once years before. He loved photography. He'd started pasting his own photographs into his diaries by the mid-1890s and would go on to fill album after album across his entire reign. He loved to read. He loved long walks in the forest, especially after rain. He loved the kind of quiet, unhurried domesticity that is frankly completely incompatible with running the largest country on earth. And his father, his enormous, iron-bending, diplomat, terrifying father, had a plan. Alexander III intended to begin properly teaching his son the art of statecraft when Nicholas turned 30, not before. He felt the boy was not yet ready. The problem was that Alexander III died of kidney disease in 1894. He was 49 years old, and Nicholas was 26. I want to pause here for a moment because there is something worth really sitting with. Alexander III essentially said, "My son is not ready to rule this empire," and then he left him the empire anyway. That is a tragedy that has nothing to do with revolution or politics or the weight of history. That is just a father who ran out of time, and a son who spent the next 23 years trying to fill shoes that were never made for his feet. The British historian Dominic Leaven, who wrote one of the most thorough studies of Nicholas II, put it this way. Nicholas's problem, he wrote, was that he could understand many points of view, and that same quality made him terrible at exercising power. In other words, the thing that made Nicholas a good human being was precisely the thing that made him a poor autocrat. He could see other perspectives, he could feel the weight of opposing arguments, and in a system that demanded one man to make absolute, final, irreversible decisions about the lives of millions of people, the ability to see all sides was not a gift. It was a quiet, slow-moving disaster. Now, here is where the story takes its first real turn. The year is 1896. Nicholas has been Tsar for nearly 2 years. He's not yet been crowned. The Russian coronation was an enormous months-long affair, and the timing had to be carefully arranged. Finally, in May of 1896, the moment arrives. The coronation takes place in the magnificent Dormition Cathedral inside the Moscow Kremlin. There are thrones centuries old. There is chanting. There is incense thick enough to see. Nicholas records the day in his diary with genuine emotion, a great solemn day he writes for Alexandra, for his mother, for himself. And for a few hours, perhaps for the first time since his father's death, he feels like this might be something he can hold. 4 days later, the Kodinka field disaster. The coronation celebrations included a public festival for the people of Moscow, a massive outdoor event at a place called Kodinka Field on the outskirts of the city. The plan was generous and genuinely well-intentioned. Free food would be distributed, free beer, and each guest would receive a special commemorative gift, a small enamelled tin mug with the Imperial double-headed eagle bread rolls from Moscow's most famous bakery sweet sausages, all of it wrapped in a handkerchief. The organising committee expected a large crowd. What they got was 500,000 people. Kodinka Field was unfortunately a military training ground, which meant it was full of ditches, hidden trenches, open pits, over 160 uneven hazards spread across an area that was now in the grey pre-dawn light, being flooded by 500,000 human beings who had heard there might not be enough cups to go around. The rumours spread through the crowd like electricity, and the crowd moved. By morning, 1,389 people were dead. Thousands more were injured. The dead were found in the ditches in the pits, crushed near the distribution stalls. There was a single well at the edge of the field where 27 people had fallen in and only one survived. That detail alone has never left me. Now, the question of what Nicholas did next is one that historians have debated for over a century, and I want to give you both sides because this story, like most real stories, is more complicated than a simple verdict. That evening, the same evening, there was a ball at the French embassy. The French ambassador had planned this event for months. Cancelling it, Nicholas's advisors argued, would cause a diplomatic incident. Nicholas attended. He stayed long enough to be seen. He danced. He smiled at the diplomats. He fulfilled his ceremonial obligations, and the people of Moscow, who had spent that same day collecting their dead, never fully forgave him for it. The nickname they gave him was Nicholas the Bloody. It was not the last time that nickname would be used. Here is where my own perspective comes in, and I offer it carefully. Nicholas, by all accounts, was genuinely devastated by Kodinka. His diary entries from those days reflect a man in real distress. He visited the injured in the hospitals the very next morning. The victims' families received financial compensation. But something crucial was missing from his response. Not sympathy, he had that. Not generosity, he demonstrated that. What was missing was the instinct to be seen grieving publicly, to cancel the ball, to say loudly to the people who had come to celebrate him, not tonight. That instinct, the political instinct, was simply not there, and it would remain absent for the next 21 years. Does that make him a bad person? No. I genuinely do not think it does. A bad person does not weep in private for the dead. A bad person does not personally visit hospitals the morning after a tragedy. But history does not ask whether you are a good person in private. History asks whether you are a capable leader in public, and those are frustratingly two entirely different questions. Let me give you another window into who this man actually was. Nicholas kept a diary for 36 years, 51 notebooks covering every single year from 1882 until just days before his death in 1918. When Soviet historians got hold of those diaries after the revolution, they were frankly disappointed. They had expected to find something scandalous, evidence of conspiracy, proof of deliberate cruelty. What they found instead was weather reports. The day was warm and clear. Took a walk with the girls. Read until 11. Alex has a slight headache. Entry after entry after entry, a man recording the texture of his daily life with the careful attention of someone who loved ordinary things deeply. Almost no politics. Almost no analysis of the crises swirling around him. One critic looking at those diaries wrote that a man with a phenomenal memory recording nothing of substance suggested something troubling about the distance between Nicholas's inner world and the world that was actually collapsing around him. But here is a different way to read the same diaries. Maybe those pages were not a record of negligence. Maybe they were a refuge. A man surrounded by impossible choices writing about the weather. A man who controlled the fate of millions writing about a walk in the forest. There is something almost unbearably human about that. And then there is his marriage. If you want to understand Nicholas II, not the Tsar, but the man, you have to understand the love story at the centre of his life. Because it is in the truest sense of the word a great love story. It is just also in the truest sense of the word a politically catastrophic one. Nicholas first saw Alex of Hesse, the German princess who had become Empress Alexandra, when he was 16 years old and she was 12. He fell for her immediately. They did not meet again for years. When they finally did as young adults, the feelings had not changed. They had intensified. Nicholas wrote in his diary that she was the woman he had dreamed of marrying since the first time he saw her. His father disapproved. The Romanov dynasty had long preferred French or Danish brides for political reasons, and a German princess from a minor court was not exactly what Alexander III had in mind. Nicholas held firm. One of the very few times in his life he held firm against serious opposition. He married Alix of Hesse in the autumn of 1894, just 3 weeks after his father's funeral. She converted to the Russian Orthodox faith, changed her name to Alexandra Feodorovna, and became Empress of Russia. And from that day forward, Nicholas was by every account absolutely devoted to her. Family photographs, it was once noted, appeared in every room of the palace, including in one slightly amusing detail recorded by a biographer, the bathroom. He spoke to her. He listened to her. He brought her into his thinking in ways that were both touching and, from a governmental standpoint, genuinely problematic. Because Alexandra had opinions, strong ones, and she had the kind of decisive, forceful character that Nicholas completely lacked. The historian Robert Massey described it simply: she had the strength of character he lacked, and he fell completely under her influence. She was not manipulating him, to be clear. She believed with her whole heart that she was helping him, that her certainty could compensate for his uncertainty, and sometimes it did. But certainty about the wrong things is not a virtue. It is just a faster path to the same destination. Here is the thing that I find myself sitting with whenever I think about Nicholas. He had remarkable qualities, genuine ones, a phenomenal memory, genuine warmth, the kind of personal charm that made even political adversaries admit they liked him as a human being. Alexander Kerensky, the revolutionary leader who would eventually force Nicholas from power, wrote later that he believed Nicholas had been truthful in every conversation he had had with him. Not a liar, not a schemer, just a man who was, in the words of his own sister, utterly unsuited to the role he'd been handed. His sister, the Grand Duchess Olga, put it this way. She said that Nicky had been trained as a soldier, that he should have been taught statesmanship instead, and that his unfitness was not his fault. I keep thinking about that phrase, his unfitness was not his fault, because if you believe that, and I think there is a strong case for believing it, then what you are looking at is not the story of a cruel ruler who deserved what came to him. You're looking at the story of a man who was handed a job he could not do by a system that would not let him say no, surrounded by a world that had no patience left for learning on the job. That world, the world outside the palace, the world that was getting colder and hungrier and more furious by the week, is where we are headed next. Because while Nicholas was taking walks in the forest and pasting photographs into albums and writing about the weather, 30,000 workers were sharpening something that was not pencils, and the winter was getting longer. Stay close. Picture this. 15 miles south of Petrograd on a clear winter morning, the birch trees stood perfectly still. No noise from the factories, no shouting from the bread lines, no Bolshevik pamphlets scattered across the ice, just birch trees and frost, and the faint sound of children laughing somewhere behind a stone wall. That was Tsarskoye Selo. The name translates beautifully and a little heartbreakingly as the Tsar's village. And in the winter of 1916 to 1917, while Petrograd was slowly tearing itself apart with hunger and exhaustion and cold anger, the Tsar's village existed in a world that felt almost sealed from time itself. I want to take you inside, not to the grand ceremonial rooms, not to the gilded halls where visiting dignitaries would have been received. Those rooms were largely empty now, draped in white dust covers, quiet as a held breath. I want to take you to the part of the Alexander Palace where the family actually lived. The East Wing. The warm, cluttered, deeply personal East Wing where the wallpapers had been chosen by Alexandra herself, where every surface held some small object that mattered to someone. and where 5 children grew up in circumstances that were in almost every way that mattered remarkably ordinary. Here is something that surprises most people when they first learn it. The Romanov children did not sleep in grand 4-poster beds beneath silk canopies. They slept on folding army cots, plain wooden collapsible army cots, labelled with each child's name, covered with thick blue blankets monogrammed with their initials. This was not poverty, obviously. It was a deliberate choice by Nicholas and Alexandra, who were genuinely worried that too much luxury would ruin their children's characters. The girls woke at 8 in the morning and took cold baths. Every morning. Cold. The elder 2, Olga and Tatiana, known between themselves as the Big Pair, shared a room. The younger 2, Maria and Anastasia, known as the Little Pair, shared another. The walls of their rooms were covered not with expensive paintings, but with icons and personal photographs. Hundreds of photographs tacked up, pinned, hanging at slightly uneven angles. This was a family that documented itself obsessively. Nicholas with his camera, Anastasia with her own little camera which she used constantly and with great enthusiasm and by all accounts very little technical skill. Now, I want to introduce you properly to the person who knew this family better than almost anyone outside the immediate circle. His name was Pierre Gilliard. He was Swiss. He'd been hired in 1905 to teach French to the 2 eldest daughters, Olga and Tatiana, and had gradually been absorbed into the family's daily life, until by 1916 he was essentially one of them. Gilliard left behind a memoir after the revolution, a book he titled 13 Years at the Russian Court, and it is one of the most intimate accounts of the Romanov household that exists anywhere. He wrote about watching the Empress Alexandra attend those first French lessons. "The Empress did not miss a single word I said," he recalled. "I had the very clear feeling that it was not a lesson I was giving, but an exam I was undergoing, which if you have ever had a parent watch your performance at something you care about is a sentence you will understand viscerally." Alexandra sat in on the lessons for weeks, monitoring every word, every grammatical correction, every moment of interaction between this young Swiss tutor and her daughters. She was not doing it to be intimidating. She was doing it because she was their mother, and their education was the thing she had the most direct control over in a life where so much else felt entirely out of her hands. Let me tell you about each of the children, because these were not just names on a family portrait, they were people, with specific habits, specific irritations, specific gifts, and I think they deserve more than a footnote in their own story. Olga was the eldest, 21 years old in the winter of 1916. She was thoughtful, sensitive, the kind of person who felt other people's pain almost physically. She liked to read more than her sisters. She wrote poetry. Gilliard described her as someone who learned her lessons better and faster than her sisters, but who had a tendency to become lazy when things came too easily. She also had, by all accounts, a genuinely hot temper that she worked very hard to keep contained, which, if you ask me, sounds like someone doing a very respectable job of being a person. By 1916, Olga had been working as a military nurse in a hospital near the palace. She had changed bedsheets, dressed wounds, sat with men who were in serious pain. A 20-year-old princess doing real nursing work. Gilliard noted later that she had overtired herself and had eventually had to shift to administrative duties. The experiences had left marks, quiet ones, the kind you do not talk about at dinner. Tatiana was the second daughter, 19 years old, reddish hair, grey eyes. By most contemporary accounts, she was considered the most physically beautiful of the 4 sisters. But what people remembered about Tatiana was not her looks, it was her composure. She was organised in a way that the rest of the family was not. She kept lists. She managed things. Her nickname among the siblings was the governess. She was her mother's daughter, emotionally and temperamentally the most attached to Alexandra, of all 4 girls the one Alexandra most naturally turned to. Pierre Gilliard wrote that Tatiana was well-balanced, but less open and spontaneous than Olga. And then he added, with a kind of precision that only comes from 13 years of close observation, "It is impossible to know what she is thinking," which is either a compliment or a polite way of saying she was extremely good at keeping her own counsel, possibly both. Maria was the 3rd daughter, 17. She was in the most uncomplicated and generous way described by almost everyone who knew her as simply kind, genuinely straightforwardly kind. Gilead called her most outstanding quality modesty and warmth. She was physically the strongest of the 4 daughters. There is a photograph from this period where she is carrying her brother Alexei when he could not walk, and she is doing it with the casual ease of someone who does this all the time, which given Alexei's condition she probably did. She was closest to Anastasia, the 2 of them functioning as their own unit, the little pair, though family members noted that Maria's personality was somewhat dominated by her younger sister's louder and more insistent presence. Which brings us naturally to Anastasia. Oh, Anastasia. Where does one even begin with Anastasia? She was 15 in the winter of 1916, short, energetic in a way that apparently exhausted everyone around her, sparkling eyes, the kind that suggest the person behind them is always about 2 seconds ahead of whatever they appear to be paying attention to. Her tutor Gilead listed her primary qualities with what reads like the careful phrasing of a man who genuinely adored his pupil, but had absolutely experienced the full range of her personality firsthand. She was mischievous. She was funny. She was the fastest learner of the 4 sisters. She was also prone to laziness. She had a sharp tongue and was not afraid to use it. She had been punished more times than any of her siblings. She had tripped servants. She had played pranks on her tutors. She had climbed trees to escape her lessons. She also played, in Gilead's words, miniature theatrical scenes with a real talent. One of the more charming documented incidents in the family's history involves Anastasia discovering the word merde in a French novel she was reading with Gilead. She did not know what it meant. She asked him directly. He flushed bright red, told her it was a very strong word one should not repeat, and suggested she ask her father. She did. Nicholas told her with what one imagines was a very composed expression the same thing. That Anastasia was apparently satisfied with this answer is either a sign of her trust in her father or a sign that she had already figured it out and was simply enjoying watching the adults be uncomfortable. I personally believe it was the second one. And then there was Alexei, 12 years old, the centre of the family's world in a way that none of them had chosen but all of them had simply accepted. The way you accept the architecture of the house you grew up in. It is just there. It is just true. It shapes everything. Gilead wrote about Alexei with a tenderness that is almost difficult to read. He was the centre of the family, he said. All hopes and love concentrated on him. When he could, he enjoyed life as a joyful boy. He never boasted of being a royal heir. It was the last thing he thought of. There is a sentence attributed to Alexei recorded by his nurse, who heard him say it more than once, that I cannot stop thinking about. He said, "When I become Tsar, there will be no poor and unhappy people. I want everyone to be happy. 12 years old. Now let me tell you something that almost never makes it into the popular retellings of this story. The Alexander Palace in 1916 had electricity, and telephones, and washing machines, and a small elevator. Nicholas had ordered these installed years before. The family was not living in some museum piece recreation of medieval monarchy. They had genuinely one of the more comfortable and practically appointed homes in Russia. There was a small slide in the garden built for the children, an icy hill near the little lake that the children used in winter with what Gilead described as enthusiastic noise. A donkey named Vanka, who'd been acquired from the Ciniselli circus, which was willing to part with him because he was, in the gentle phrasing of the circus management, too infirm for performances. Vanka had apparently transferred his performing instincts seamlessly to palace life. He turned pockets inside out in search of sweets. He chewed old rubber balls. He had Gilead remembered with obvious affection, one eye closed like an old rogue. The family also had dogs, several. Anastasia's king Charles Spaniel was named Jimmy. Tatiana had a French bulldog named Ortino. There were cats. There were lessons every morning at 9. There was lunch together. There were afternoon walks and evening reading and the small repeated rhythms of a household that knew how to be a household. Here is the thing I keep circling back to. On any given afternoon in the winter of 1916, you could have walked into the private quarters of the Alexander Palace and found something like this Alexandra at her writing desk composing her daily letter to Nicholas. Tatiana in the next room reading to her. Olga somewhere quiet with a book or her thoughts, or both. Maria helping with something because Maria always helped with something. Anastasia doing something she was not supposed to be doing, probably involving the cat. Alexei at his lessons with Gilead conjugating French verbs or listening to history, or asking the kind of questions that made his tutor stop and think. And somewhere in the palace, in the kitchens, in the hallways, in the rooms of the servants who had been with this family for years, ordinary daily life was moving forward with all its textures and sounds and small moments. It was in the truest sense of the word a home, not a prison, not yet, a home. With a Christmas tree in December of 1916 that was decorated with antique ornaments in the private rooms of the Empress, in the east wing where the wallpaper was warm and the light was soft and the children were still there and accounted for. That Christmas of 1916 was the last time a Christmas tree was ever decorated in the Alexander Palace. Nobody knew that then, and here is where the beauty of this picture becomes something more complicated. Because while Olga was writing poetry, and Anastasia was making everyone laugh, and little Alexei was dreaming of a Russia without poor or unhappy people, 15 miles away in the city that could be reached in under an hour by train. The women who had been standing in the bread line since before dawn were not laughing. They were very tired. They had been tired for a long time, and something in the particular quality of that tiredness had begun that winter to change. Not louder exactly, not more aggressive, not yet, just different. The way a fire that has been burning low for hours sometimes shifts not dramatically, not with a roar but with a small quiet deepening of its heat. That shift was happening 15 miles away, while the Christmas tree candles burned down in the east wing of the Alexander Palace, and the children slept under their blue monogrammed blankets on their folding army cots. The distance between those two worlds was 15 miles, and it had never felt further, and it had never been closer to collapsing entirely. The story of that collapse and the woman at the centre of the palace's inner world, who many blamed for it, and many defended and almost no one fully understood, is where we are going next. Because there is one more person in this house who has not yet had her full moment, and she deserves one. Let me ask you something. Have you ever known someone who walked into a room and changed the temperature of it? Not loudly, not dramatically, just the air shifted. Something became different. You could not quite explain it, but you could feel it. Grigory Rasputin was that person. Except the room he walked into was not a dinner party or a workplace meeting. It was the private chambers of the last imperial family of Russia, and the change he brought with him into that room took 10 years to fully detonate. By the autumn of 1916, Rasputin was 47 years old. He'd been connected to the Romanov household for a decade. He was known and hated and feared and whispered about across the entire Russian Empire. Soldiers at the front passed gossip about him in the trenches. Peasants in villages had their own versions of his legend. Aristocratic women collected stories about him the way some people collect terrible warnings they cannot quite stop thinking about. And none of those stories agreed with each other, which is, if you know anything about truly unusual people, entirely predictable. Let me start the beginning. Because the real Rasputin, not the myth, not the movie villain, not the song, was far stranger and far more interesting than any simplified version. He was born in 1869 in the village of Pokrovskoye, a tiny settlement along the Tura River in western Siberia, so remote that if you blinked on a map of the Russian Empire you would miss it entirely. His father was a peasant farmer and village elder. His mother had 8 children, of whom Grigory was the only one to survive early childhood. He grew up illiterate. He was by all early accounts unremarkable, except for a faint and persistent reputation for being a little unusual, a little difficult to read, magnetic even then in a way that made people slightly uncertain around him. He married young, he had children, he drank. He got into trouble in the ordinary ways that young men in remote Siberian villages got into trouble. And then, in 1897, something changed. He went on a pilgrimage. He walked to the St. Nicholas Monastery at Verkhoturye, roughly 300 miles from his home village, and when he came back, the people who knew him said they did not quite recognize him. He had stopped drinking. He had stopped eating meat. He walked differently. He spoke differently. Whatever had happened to him in that monastery, whether it was genuine spiritual experience, psychological transformation, or something else that does not have a clean name, it had rearranged something fundamental inside him. He became, over the next several years, a stranic, a holy wanderer, a pilgrim without a fixed destination, someone who travelled from village to village, sleeping in barns, eating what was given, and drawing people to him with a quality that was apparently very hard to describe and even harder to ignore. By 1903 he had made his way to St. Petersburg, and St. Petersburg in 1903 was ready for him. Here is something that often gets left out of the Rasputin story. The aristocracy of St. Petersburg in the early 1900s was deeply, even fervently absorbed in mysticism. Seances were fashionable. Fortune-tellers were received in drawing rooms. Faith healers, visionaries, people who claimed to speak to spirits or predict the future, all of them found a ready audience among the bored, anxious, wealthy elite of the capital. One historian described the city as entertaining itself by delving into mysticism and the occult, which means that when a wild-eyed Siberian peasant with allegedly extraordinary healing powers arrived in the city, he was not dismissed. He was welcomed, enthusiastically, by exactly the people who then introduced him to exactly the right other people. By 1905, Rasputin had been introduced to the Tsar. Nicholas recorded the moment in his diary with his characteristic precise simplicity. "We made the acquaintance of a man of God," he wrote, "Grigory from Tobolsk province. Now." There is a moment, one specific documented moment that cemented everything that followed. The year was 1912. Alexei had suffered one of his most serious crises. A carriage accident had triggered severe internal bleeding that the court doctors could not stop. The boy was in profound pain for weeks. Alexandra was in a state of frantic, sleepless desperation. The doctors offered nothing. In her anguish, Alexandra sent word to Rasputin, who was not in Petrograd at the time. He sent back a telegram. The exact wording of the telegram has been debated, but its effect was not. Alexei's bleeding slowed, then stopped. Was it the telegram itself? Was it the coincidence of the body's own healing finally catching up? Was it, as Pierre Gilliard and later medical historians have suggested, the simple biological fact that calming the mother calmed the child, and a calmer child has lower blood pressure, which slows the bleeding. We do not know with certainty. What we know is what Alexandra believed. She believed it was Rasputin. She believed it completely. And that belief became the foundation of everything else. Let me be honest with you about something. I have spent a lot of time with this story, and I find Rasputin genuinely difficult to settle into a clean verdict. He was not the evil genius the revolutionary press made him out to be. He did not whisper secret policies into Alexandra's ear in the manner of some puppet master. But he was also not simply a well-meaning peasant faith healer whose reputation was unfairly destroyed. The truth is messier. By 1915, when Nicholas left Petrograd to command the army leaving Alexandra in effective control of the capital, Rasputin's influence over appointments had become real. Ministers were removed, others installed. The speed of turnover through the government became alarming. Between 1915 and 1917, Russia went through 4 prime ministers, 4 ministers of agriculture, 5 ministers of the interior, and 3 ministers of war. 4 prime ministers in 2 years, in the middle of a world war. One observer called it ministerial leapfrog. That is not satire. That is a first-hand account from the period. And while not every one of those changes was directly attributable to Rasputin's influence, enough of them were to make the pattern visible and the damage real. Even Nicholas's own uncle, Grand Duke Nikolai Mikhailovich, wrote to the Tsar privately in 1916. He was direct in the way only a family member can afford to be. "You believe, Alexandra, that is understandable," the Grand Duke wrote. But what comes out of her mouth is the result of a clever manipulation, and not the real truth. If you could eliminate this constant intrusion of dark forces into all affairs, the revival of Russia would immediately begin. Nicholas received this letter. He read it. He sent his uncle into exile. Here is where the story becomes something that I think about a great deal, because here is a question worth sitting with. Was Rasputin actually the problem, or was he a symptom of the problem? A mirror that reflected uncomfortably precisely what was already broken. Think about it this way. If Nicholas had been a stronger ruler, if he had the decisive iron-backed authority that his father Alexander III projected, Rasputin would never have gotten within a mile of a policy decision. A confident, firmly anchored Tsar does not outsource his government to his wife's faith healer. If Alexandra had not been consumed by terror for her son's life, if Alexei had been healthy, there would have been no Rasputin-shaped hole in the imperial household waiting to be filled. If the aristocracy had not been so busy playing at mysticism, so spiritually unmoored and fascinated by the exotic, the court of St. Petersburg would never have opened its doors to a wandering Siberian peasant quite so enthusiastically. Rasputin did not create the weakness he exploited. He moved into a space that was already there. That does not make him innocent. But it does make the story a great deal more complicated than a simple tale of one charismatic villain bringing down an empire. By the summer and autumn of 1916, things had reached a point that could not be sustained. The war was consuming everything. The government was changing hands faster than anyone could track. The rumours about Rasputin had grown so extreme, so colourful, so relentlessly salacious, that they had taken on a life entirely separate from anything factual. Pornographic cartoons depicting him and the Empress were circulating in the capital. He was described in newspapers as the secret ruler of Russia. One member of the Duma, a passionate patriot named Vladimir Purishkevich, gave a 2-hour speech denouncing what he called the dark forces surrounding the throne, a speech that was by accounts from the chamber applauded thunderously. Even Rasputin himself seemed to sense the ground shifting. His daughter Maria later wrote that in the autumn of 1916 her father appeared changed. He had become nervous. He was drinking more heavily again. He spoke sometimes, she said, about feeling that something was coming. He had reportedly said to those close to him, "If I die or you desert me, you will lose your son and your crown within 6 months." Whether those words were spoken exactly that way, or whether they were sharpened in the retelling, no one can say with certainty. But the timeline afterward was not completely wrong. On the evening of December the 16th, 1916, a date that falls in the Russian calendar, but which translates to December the 30th by the Gregorian calendar, most of the world uses Rasputin dressed carefully for a social visit. He wore a silk shirt embroidered with cornflowers. It had been made for him specifically by the Empress Alexandra. He wore velvet breeches and polished boots. He had washed his hair. He had combed it. He smelled, by the account of the man who came to collect him, of cheap soap. He was driven by a chauffeur to a grand palace on the Moika River in the centre of Petrograd, the Yusupov Palace, the home of Prince Felix Yusupov, 29 years old, immensely wealthy, married to the Tsar's niece, and possessed of the kind of absolute certainty about his own judgment that tends to produce extremely poor decisions. Yusupov had convinced himself and a small circle of co-conspirators, including Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, who was the Tsar's own cousin, and Vladimir Purishkevich, the Duma member, who had given that thundering anti-Rasputin speech that removing Rasputin was a patriotic act. That killing one man would somehow restore the reputation of the throne, bring Nicholas back from the front and stop the machine of collapse that was already very much in motion. I want to pause here and say something I believe genuinely. Yusupov was not simply an evil person. He was a young man who loved his country in the way people do when they are scared and privileged, and certain they understand more than they do. He was also, as Nicholas's eldest daughter Olga observed around this time, someone who had spent the war years doing essentially nothing useful, while other men of his generation were bleeding in the trenches. "Felix is a downright civilian," she wrote to her father, "dressed all in brown, virtually doing nothing, an utterly unpleasant impression, a man idling in such times." Plotting Rasputin's removal gave him something he had been lacking: a role, a purpose, a story he could tell about himself. What happened that night in the basement of the Yusupov Palace has been retold so many times in so many versions that separating the fact from the spectacular has become a historical project in itself. The legend says Rasputin ate pastries full of cyanide, drank wine full of cyanide, survived all of it, without apparent effect, survived a gunshot to the chest, got up and tried to escape, was shot again, was beaten, was finally thrown through the ice of the Neva River, and was still alive when he hit the water. The legend is, by all modern forensic and historical analysis, substantially exaggerated. Here is what we actually know from the autopsy, the physical evidence and the accounts that hold up to scrutiny. Rasputin arrived at the Yusupov Palace that night. He was taken to the basement. He was shot. The final forensic evidence points to a close-range gunshot wound to the head as the cause of death. The famous cyanide story almost certainly did not happen as described. Rasputin's daughter, who knew him well later, noted that he did not like sweet foods and would never have eaten a plate of cakes. The official autopsy found no evidence of poison. The doctor who was supposedly supplying the cyanide was reported in one account to have had what the historical record refers to with admirable restraint as a change of heart, and may have substituted something far less lethal: the elaborate multi-hour drama of a man who could not be killed. That story was told almost entirely in books written by Felix Yusupov, books he published in exile in Paris. Books, it is worth noting, that were written after he'd lost his enormous fortune in the revolution and needed income. As one historian put it, Yusupov transformed a murder into an epic struggle of good against evil, primarily to sell books, and to bolster a reputation that had not by most accounts been bolstered by anything else he had done. What is true, what is documented and sobering and worth sitting with is what happened in the hours after. Rasputin's body was wrapped. It was driven to the large Petrovsky Bridge in the frozen dark before dawn, and it was thrown through the broken ice into a smaller branch of the Neva River. His body was found days later. Alexandra, when she received the news, was devastated in the way someone is when the thing they had convinced themselves was holding everything together turns out to have been mortal after all. She had Rasputin's body brought to Tsarskoye Selo. She buried him initially in a corner of the grounds. She placed an icon over his grave. She is reported to have folded a note and placed it in his hands before the casket was closed. The note was never recovered. We do not know what she wrote, and I find I do not want to speculate. Some things are private enough that they belong to the person who wrote them. Here is what the conspirators did not understand. They believed that removing Rasputin would save the dynasty. What they actually did was remove the one thing that was, however, imperfectly keeping Alexandra's fear in check. Without Rasputin, the empress became more rigid, more isolated, more certain that the answer was simply to hold everything tighter, change nothing, trust no one. As one historian wrote in a sentence so precise it almost feels unkind, the murder merely strengthened Alexandra's resolve to uphold the principle of autocracy. But a few weeks later, the whole imperial regime was swept away by revolution. 6 weeks. From Rasputin's death in December of 1916 to the February Revolution of 1917. 6 weeks. The conspirators had convinced themselves they were saving Russia. They had instead removed the last piece of insulation from a fuse that has been burning for years, and the shirt with the cornflowers, the one Alexandra had embroidered for him. He wore it the night he came to that basement. I do not know why that detail stays with me more than almost any other. But it does. Maybe because it is the kind of small human thing that gets lost in the grand machinery of historical events. A shirt made by a mother for a man she trusted to keep her child alive, worn on the last night of his life, going to meet people who had already decided how that night would end. 6 weeks. The women at the bread lines were not counting, but history was, and in just a moment we're going to stand with those women, in the cold, in the dark, at the very end of their patience, because the revolution did not begin in a palace, it did not begin in a manifesto, it did not begin with a speech or a plan or a powerful man's decision. It began with people who simply could not take one more cold morning with empty hands. That story is next. Somewhere between Petrograd and Mogilev there is a railway line. 500 miles of it roughly cutting through birch forests and frozen fields, past small station platforms where station masters in heavy coats stamp their feet against the cold and watch certain trains go by without stopping. Those trains carried only one passenger of consequence. On a regular train, 500 miles in 1915 would take the better part of a day, maybe longer depending on the season and the ice on the tracks. But the train I am thinking of long dark green, equipped with a telephone and a telegraph, and a private study, and a dining car made that journey back and forth so many times between 1915 and 1917 that the track inspectors who maintained those particular miles of rail had an easier job than usual. Those rails stayed polished. That train never stopped moving for long, and the man who rode it was trying to hold together two things at once that were pulling further and further apart with every passing week: his family and his empire. In the end, he could not hold either. The decision Nicholas made in August of 1915 to take personal command of the Russian Imperial Army was not impulsive. He had been wanting to do it since the very beginning of the war. At the outbreak of hostilities in 1914, his advisers had talked him out of it. His cabinet almost unanimously thought it was a terrible idea. Even his allies were quietly alarmed. But by the summer of 1915, the Russian army was in catastrophic retreat. The numbers from that period are almost too large to hold in the mind as real things. In the 6 weeks between mid-July and late August of 1915, Russia lost over 1 million men killed, wounded, or taken prisoner in what became known as the Great Retreat. 1 million people in 6 weeks. The army had been driven back 300 miles along the entire Eastern Front. Poland was abandoned, Lithuania was abandoned, parts of what is now Belarus had fallen under German occupation. 23 million Russians were now living under enemy control. And there was a weapons shortage so severe that 1/3 of the soldiers at the front had no rifles. 1/3. Men were being sent to war and told to wait until the soldier beside them fell before they could pick up his weapon and fight with it themselves. Nicholas, when he read reports about this situation, wrote to Alexandra in distress. Again that cursed question of shortage of artillery and rifle ammunition. It stands in the way of an energetic advance. If we should have 3 days of serious fighting, we might run out of ammunition altogether. Then he added in the quiet, almost tender self-consciousness that characterizes his private correspondence. It is understood, of course, that what I say is strictly for you only. Please do not say a word to anyone. A man in command of the largest land army in the world confiding his military anxieties to his wife, and asking her with almost childlike trust to keep them secret, so he went to Mogilev. The town's name, incidentally, comes from the Russian word Mogyla, which means grave. History has a sense of humour that is not always kind. Nicholas arrived in Mogilev in September of 1915 and set up his headquarters called the Stavka in the local governor's house. He appointed General Mikhail Alexeyev as his chief of staff. He brought his motorcars because Nicholas was genuinely fond of motorcars and had a special railway carriage built just to transport them. His daily routine at Mogilev settled quickly into something that looked from the outside surprisingly ordinary. At 11 each morning, Alexeyev and the quartermaster general would come to report on the war. Nicholas would listen, he would nod. He would occasionally ask questions, and then to most matters of actual tactical decision he would say something that became quietly legendary among the officers who heard it. You must ask Alexeyev. That is not invented. That was observed and recorded by people who were in those rooms. A French observer at the Stavka noted the dynamic with the kind of polite diplomatic precision that the French are particularly good at. It is Alexeyev whom one obeys, he wrote, or rather disobeys. In the afternoons after the reports and the meetings, Nicholas would take long walks through the forest outside Mogilev. Walking stick in one hand, cigarette in the other, the pine trees standing in their winter silence around him. There is something about that image that I cannot quite shake. The last Tsar of Russia walking through a pine forest in the middle of a world war alone with his cigarette and his thoughts, while hundreds of miles away, both in the direction of the front and in the direction of home, everything was quietly coming apart. Now, here is where I want to stay for a while. Because the separation between Nicholas at the front and Alexandra in Petrograd was not just a geographical fact, it was a structural catastrophe, and it played out word by word in the letters they wrote each other, every day, sometimes twice a day, occasionally more. Their wartime correspondence, eventually published in full, eventually read and analysed by historians across the world, is one of the most extraordinary documents of the 20th century. Not because it is politically sophisticated, not because it reveals dark conspiracies, but because it is so nakedly, intimately human. And because that humanity in the context of what was happening to Russia reads almost like a slow-motion catastrophe. Let me give you a sense of what these letters actually were. Nicholas's side of the correspondence is full of what he loved. Weather reports, the light on the Dnieper River, how Alexei was doing during the visits when his son came to stay at the Stavka, the expressions on soldiers' faces when he reviewed troops, how good the trout from Finland tasted at dinner. In one letter from September of 1916, he writes to Alexandra about returning to his quarters after a visit, and the sadness of it. It was very sad and distressing coming back from the station. I plunged into my papers, and he went to have his dinner. He said his prayers hurriedly and is now sound asleep. He is writing about Alexei, his 12-year-old son having prayers hurriedly in a military headquarters while the war grinds on outside the window. That sentence contains an entire world. Alexandra's letters are different in almost every way. They are urgent, they are dense, they are full of opinions about ministers, about the Duma, about who should be kept in power and who should be dismissed, and threaded through all of it like a recurring pulse is the voice of Rasputin, whom she called always our friend. In December of 1916, just weeks before Rasputin's death, she wrote to Nicholas, "He entreats you to be firm to be the master, and not always to give in. You know much better than that man. Remember why I am disliked shows it right to be firm and feared. We must give a strong country to baby, and dare not be weak for his sake." And then the line that historians have quoted ever since because it reveals so much about where Alexandra's mind had gone by that point. Russia wants to feel the whip. Tender love and then the iron hand to punish and guide. That sentence was written by a woman who had been born a German princess converted to Russian Orthodoxy, who had lived in the Alexander Palace for 20 years, and still at the end of it understood the country she was ruling with the distance of someone reading about it from the outside. I do not say that to be unkind. I say it because it matters, because a ruler or a ruler's most trusted advisor, who believes that the answer to mass suffering is severity, will always be proved wrong by the suffering. Here is the question I keep turning over. Was Alexandra giving Nicholas bad political advice because she was fundamentally mistaken, or was she giving him bad advice because she was afraid for Alexei? Afraid that any loosening of the grip on power meant the throne would be lost and with it the protection her son needed. The stability, the resources, the imperial doctors, the position that kept Alexei from simply being a sick boy with no options. She was wrong about the political strategy. But the fear underneath it was not irrational. It was a mother's fear, dressed up in the language of autocracy, and Nicholas, who could not say no to his wife, and could not quite face the alternatives, and could not quite bring himself to believe the empire was actually in danger. Nicholas said yes, or more accurately, he said nothing, which in practice amounted to the same thing. The letters continued every day through the autumn of 1916. Nicholas writing about pine forests and trout and the look on soldiers' faces. Alexandra writing about the whip and the iron hand and the ministers who needed dismissing. And the train rolling back and forth on those 500 miles of well-maintained track. There is a particular entry from one of Nicholas's Mogilev letters that stays with me. He had written something gentle, something about missing her, something about the view from his window, and then almost as an afterthought in that characteristic way he had of folding important things into ordinary sentences, he mentioned the war. Specifically, he mentioned the news from the front. It was not good. It was almost never good. But the way he wrote about it with a kind of quiet resignation, a sense of things happening around him, rather than to him, a certain helpless distance from the machinery of it, suggested something that I think his generals knew, and his cabinet knew, and the diplomats in those embassies along the Nevsky Prospect knew. Nicholas II was not commanding this war. He was witnessing it. From a comfortable governor's house in a town whose name meant grave. Now I want to make something clear, because this part of the story is easy to tell in a way that flattens everyone involved into simple figures of failure. the incompetent Tsar, the meddling empress, the chaos they created together. But here is what the flat version misses. The Russian army under Alexiev's actual operational command during this period was not simply collapsing. In the summer of 1916, General Alexei Brusilov launched one of the most successful offensives of the entire war. The Brusilov Offensive, it was called. In roughly 10 weeks, it inflicted close to 1 million casualties on the Austro-Hungarian forces. It was the offensive during which, for essentially the first time in the war, Russian soldiers actually had enough rifles. It pushed the front lines back significantly. It was by any military standard a brilliant piece of work. Nicholas was there when it happened. His presence had not stopped it. His limitations had not prevented it. Which means the story is more nuanced than pure failure. The real problem was not that Nicholas made terrible military decisions. The real problem was that he had linked his personal reputation so completely to the army's performance that every loss, and there were many, many losses, became his loss. And every loss made him weaker. And every loss gave the Petrograd workers and the Petrograd soldiers one more reason to believe that the system at the top simply could not be trusted. By November of 1916, the correspondence between them had taken on a new urgency. Rasputin's assassination was just weeks away. The revolution was less than 4 months away. But in the letters there is no sense that either of them understood how close they were to the edge. Nicholas was writing about walks in the forest. Alexandra was writing about ministers, and the train kept moving, back and forth, Mogilev to Petrograd, Petrograd to Mogilev, like a needle on a meter swinging steadily toward a number neither of them had been taught to read. There is one last detail from this period that I want to give you. When Nicholas arrived at Mogilev in September of 1915 on that first day settling in for what became nearly 2 years of residence, he brought one specific object with him. Not a military map, not a tactical manual, not any of the things you might expect a man taking command of an army in a world war to carry. He brought an icon of St. Nicholas, given to him by Rasputin. He placed it in his study, and there it stayed throughout the years of the war, while Alexeyev briefed him on operations, while the casualties mounted, while the food prices in Petrograd rose and rose and rose, while the bread line stretched longer into the dark mornings, the icon of a saint, given by a man who was already dead, watching over a study where the last Tsar of Russia went through the motions of commanding a war he did not know how to fight. Meanwhile, in Petrograd, the bread lines, that is where we go now. Not to a palace, not to a headquarters, not to a train moving quietly through the trees, to the bread lines, to the women who had been standing in the cold since before the sun came up, with children on their hips and nothing in their pockets, trying to hold on to what was left of their patience, and running out of it finally on a specific morning, on a specific street, in a specific city, in a specific winter, the morning the Empire's quiet days ended. There is a document, dated October 1916, filed in secret by a division of the Okhrana Russia's Imperial Secret Police, the people whose job it was to know exactly how close to the edge the country was standing. And what makes this document extraordinary is not its language of bureaucratic caution. It is the opposite. Whoever wrote it had apparently reached the point where careful diplomatic phrasing felt inadequate to the truth. The report opens with a description of what was happening in Petrograd as something that had achieved such an extreme and monstrous stage that it threatened to plunge the country into the destructive chaos of catastrophic and elemental anarchy. The secret police, describing their own country in those words. And then further down the page, the officer who wrote it added something that I keep returning to, because it is one of the most honest things anyone in a position of authority admitted during this entire period. He described the workers of Petrograd as having been pushed beyond the point of ordinary discontent into something that could only be described in his words as preparedness for the wildest excesses of a hunger riot. This was October of 1916. The revolution was still 4 months away. The Tsar was in Mogilev taking walks in the pine forest, and his own secret police were filing reports that read like the opening chapters of a catastrophe. Let me take you across the city, away from the Nevsky Prospect with its golden lamps and restaurant windows, away from the Winter Palace and the embassies and the clubs where the educated classes argued about politics over dinner, across the river Neva to the Vyborg district. In the northeast corner of Petrograd, separated from the wealthier parts of the city by the river, there was a world that most of the people in those restaurant windows never thought about and never visited. The Vyborg district was a mass of factories, enormous ones, the kind of factories that make most modern facilities look modest. The Putilov Works, Petrograd's largest industrial plant employing around 30,000 people, was among them. The pipe works, another 30,000. The Obukhov machine building works, 13,000. 70% of Petrograd's workers worked in factories of over 1,000 employees. That figure, when I first encountered it, stopped me. 70%. Because what that means when you think about it carefully is that this was not a city of small workshops and individual craftsmen. This was a city of industrial scale, of enormous concentrations of people pressed together doing the same dangerous work, breathing the same air, sharing the same exhaustion, and in 1916 sharing the same fury. What did a Petrograd factory worker's life actually look like in the winter of 1916 to 1917? I want to give you the real picture, not the abstraction. The workday was 10 hours. That had been the standard before the war. By 1916, many workers were doing 11 or 12 hours daily because the war demanded it. 6 days a week. The factory floor was cold or unbearably hot depending on the season and the machinery. Accidents were common, injuries were common, and the risk of both was simply part of the contract of showing up. Foremen enforced discipline not just through rules and fines, but by documented accounts, sometimes through their fists. And the housing. Let me tell you about the housing. In the tenement buildings of the Vyborg district, families of 5 and 6 people, sometimes more, shared a single room. A single room. Not a small apartment. Not a cramped flat. One room, with cold walls that let in the wind. With shared water facilities that were often broken or frozen. With the kind of dampness that settles into everything, clothes, bedding, lungs, and does not leave until spring. One resident from this period described waking up to find the moisture on the inside of the window had frozen overnight. On the inside. Now. Here is the piece of this story that is genuinely deeply ironic. In a narrow technical sense, wages had risen during the war. Metal workers, machinists, and electricians had seen their wages increase by somewhere between 50 and 200% since 1914. 50 to 200%. On paper, that sounds like prosperity. But food prices had risen by between 100 and 500% over the same period. Let me hold those two numbers side by side for a moment. Wages up 50 to 200%. Food prices up 100 to 500%, which means that a worker who was earning twice what they earned before the war was still losing ground, still buying less, still eating less, still watching the gap between what they had and what things cost get wider, not narrower. The Okhrana report from October of 1916 said it plainly. Despite the great increase in wages, the economic condition of the masses is worse than terrible. This is a document filed by the government's own surveillance arm, telling the government something the government had apparently not managed to process. Why had food prices risen so dramatically? This is the part of the story where the machinery of the crisis becomes visible. The government had been financing the war by printing money. Millions and millions of rubles pumped into the economy without any corresponding increase in goods or production. By 1917, inflation had driven prices to roughly 4 times what they had been in 1914. And here is the further complication. The farmers who grew food had noticed that the money they were being paid for their grain was worth less every month. So they started doing what rational people do when they notice that a transaction is becoming increasingly unfavourable. They stopped making that transaction. They kept their grain. They reverted to feeding their own families and storing what they could. They stopped sending food to the cities, which meant Petrograd, a city that was not near any agriculturally rich areas, to begin with. A city that was receiving by documented accounts only about a third of the fuel and goods it actually needed, was simultaneously receiving less food from the countryside, while hosting a growing population of workers and refugees. The bread lines got longer, not because there was some dramatic single moment of catastrophe, but because of the quiet grinding logic of a system that was slowly eating itself. One detail that I find almost unbearably human in its precision, the Trans-Siberian Railway, that extraordinary engineering achievement that connected European Russia to the Pacific, was by 1916 so completely clogged with military supply trains that civilian food shipments were being delayed for weeks. There are documented accounts of food trains sitting on sidings outside Petrograd, waiting for military trains to clear the way. The food spoiled. People went hungry, not because the food did not exist, but because the trains carrying it were stuck behind the trains carrying shells. A city going hungry while food rotted in railway cars a few miles away. I have read that detail multiple times, and every time it lands differently. Now, I want to talk about something that the official histories often present in a very compressed way. The radicalization of the Petrograd working class did not happen overnight. It happened in waves. 1914. The war starts. There is a brief burst of patriotic support. Strikes almost stop entirely. 1915. The military disasters begin. The shell shortages become public knowledge. The first serious wave of strikes returns. 1916. The numbers become staggering. In 1916 alone, there were over 1,200 strikes across Russia, involving close to 1 million workers. In Petrograd specifically, in that single year, there were 330 political strikes involving over 377,000 people, and 354 economic strikes involving over 243,000 more. Stop and think about that for a moment. Political strikes, not just people demanding higher wages, people stopping work as a deliberate political statement, in a country where doing that could get you arrested, or conscripted and sent to the front, which it turned out did not stop them. Here is something the history books tend to underemphasize. The workers of Petrograd in 1916 were not simply desperate and angry, they were organized. The metal workers of the Vyborg district, who represented just about 1% of Russia's total industrial working class, were responsible for 45.7% of all political strikes in the country. 1% of workers, 45% of the political strikes. These were not people acting randomly out of hunger. These were people who had learned through years of failed strikes and arrests and deportations to Siberia how to build networks, how to communicate, how to time actions for maximum effect. The Okhrana knew about all of this, of course. They had their informants, they made their arrests, they sent their reports, and those reports landed in offices, where officials read them, filed them, and apparently concluded that the appropriate response was to continue doing what they had been doing. There is a phrase I came across in the historical accounts of this period that I have not been able to shake. American historians Lawrence Hameson and Eric Bryan, studying the October strikes of 1916, a massive surge of stoppages involving up to 100,000 workers, described those events in retrospect as something haunting. They called them a tryout of the February Revolution, a rehearsal, spontaneous, driven by bread shortages, with bakery storefronts, targeted demonstrations in the streets, even early moments of Cossack soldiers refusing to charge the crowds. A tryout. And the government looked at it, suppressed it, filed the reports, and did not fundamentally change anything. 4 months later, the main performance began. I find myself thinking about the workers of Petrograd in the way I think about anyone who has been patient for a very long time, longer really than patience can sustainably hold. 10 years of labor organizing, arrested and deported. 1 year of wartime sacrifice, told it would be worth it. 2 years of watching prices climb while wages crawled. 12 hours a day in a factory 6 days a week. Going home to a single room that was damp and cold. Waking up before dawn to stand in a bread line. Sometimes finding bread. Sometimes finding an empty shelf and a closed door. There is a documented worker's diary entry from this period recorded and preserved that reads simply, "We have no bread, no work, and no hope." 3 things. Most people can endure losing 1. Many people can endure losing 2. But when all 3 are gone at the same time, what you have is not a population. What you have is a spark looking for somewhere to land. Now let me show you where it landed. Because the spark, when it finally caught, did not come from where most people would have expected. It did not come from the Bolsheviks. It did not come from a pamphlet or a speech or a plan hatched in someone's study. It came from women, standing in the cold, on a specific morning, on a specific street, demanding a specific simple, unglamorous thing, bread. And what happened next, what those women started and how it spread and who joined them, and what the soldiers did when they were ordered to stop it, is one of the most extraordinary 48 hours in modern history. It is also, in my view, one of the least told, because the story of revolutions tends to centre on the men who gave speeches afterward, not the women who stood in the cold first. That story is where we go next. February the 23rd, 1917. Old Russian calendar. March the 8th on the calendar most of the world was using. International Women's Day. And here is the thing that I want you to hold on to before we go any further into this morning. Nobody, not the Bolsheviks, not the revolutionary committees, not the socialist organizers who had been working toward this moment for years, nobody expected that day to be the first day of the Russian Revolution. Not a single person in a position of political authority woke up that morning thinking this is it. In fact, a Bolshevik organizer named Kayurov had stood in front of a meeting of women textile workers in the Vyborg district the very night before February the 22nd and told them explicitly not to strike. "Keep calm," he said. "Wait for the party's instructions. The time is not yet right." And those women looked at him, and they said in effect, "We appreciate your input." And the next morning they walked out of their factories anyway. I find this detail almost unbearably good. Here is a party that had been building toward revolution for years, that had developed theories, strategies, timelines, organizational structures, that had debated endlessly about the correct moment to act. And when the revolution actually began, it began because a group of women who'd been standing in bread lines since before dawn, who'd been working 13-hour shifts in unheated textile mills, who'd been waiting for their husbands and brothers and sons to come home from a war that showed no signs of ending. Those women simply decided they were done waiting. The most important political event of the 20th century was started not by a plan, not by a manifesto, not by a meeting of party officials. It was started by women throwing snowballs at factory windows. Let me set the scene for you. February the 23rd, 1917. The temperature that morning was around 23 degrees Fahrenheit. Cold, certainly. But by Petrograd winter standards, actually somewhat mild for late February, even by some contemporary accounts, accompanied by a watery winter sunshine. The streets of the Viborg district were already busy before the factories had fully opened. Women who had stood in bread lines that morning had found at many of the bakeries either empty shelves or padlocked doors. Fuel shortages had been preventing bakeries from firing their ovens properly for days. What bread had been baked had sold before the lines had moved through. A fuel shortage had stopped the bakeries, which meant there was no bread, and the women who had come to buy it, some of them with children waiting at home, some of them still in their factory coats because they had come straight from the night shift, stood in front of closed doors, and then did not go home. They went to the factories. The women textile workers of the Viborg district walked out of the mills that morning, not all of them at once, not in a single coordinated rush, in groups, then in streams, then in a wave. And as they left, they moved through the district doing something that I think is one of the most vivid and human things in this entire story. They went from factory to factory, knocking on doors, calling through windows, shouting up at the men working inside. One worker at the Nobel Engineering Works left behind an account of what that moment looked like from the inside. He was at his workbench when he heard voices in the lane outside, women's voices, shouting, "Down with high prices, down with hunger, bread for the workers." He and his co-workers rushed to the windows. Below them, filling the lane, were masses of women, in a militant frame of mind. He remembered looking up at the factory windows. When they saw the men watching, the women started waving their arms. "Come out, stop work." And then, because polite requests had apparently not been getting results up to this point in Russian history, snowballs came through the windows. I want to pause here and just appreciate that detail for a moment. A revolution that toppled 300 years of autocracy, that changed the map of the world, that shaped the entire 20th century, started with women throwing snowballs at factory windows. There is something about that which feels more true and more human than almost anything else I know about this story. The men came out. Not immediately, and not all of them. Some needed persuading, some needed the snowballs, but they came, and as they did, the numbers grew. By the end of that first day, February the 23rd, the Ukraina counted approximately 75,000 people on strike across the city. 60,000 of those 75,000 were from the Viborg district alone. The marchers tried to cross the bridges from the Viborg district into the city centre. Police had blocked the main crossings, and here is the detail that once you know it makes the whole thing feel almost mythological. It was winter. The Neva River was frozen. Workers who could not get past the police at the bridges simply walked across the ice, directly, through the cold, to the city on the other side. Now, before we go further, I want to tell you something about who these women actually were, because the stories of revolutions tend to flatten people into symbols, and these women deserve more than symbolism. By 1917, there were close to 1 million female workers in Russia's cities. They had entered the industrial workforce in huge numbers since the start of the war, because the war had taken the men, and someone had to keep the factories running. Between 1914 and 1917, around 250,000 women began working outside the home for the full time for the first time. They were paid roughly half of what male workers earned for the same work. They worked 12 to 13-hour shifts in textile mills with poor ventilation and inadequate heating. They came home to those single rooms, to those cold walls, to those families waiting, and then they stood in the bread lines. After the shift. Before the shift. Sometimes during the shift if they could get away and get back without being noticed. The journalist Ariadna Tirkova, watching what was happening in Petrograd during the war years, wrote something that I find very hard to forget. Day by day, the war has changed attitudes about woman, she wrote. it has become increasingly clear that the unseen effort of a woman and her labour often support the entire economy of a country. The unseen effort. That phrase, now a name that almost never makes it into the popular histories of this moment. Alexandra Kollontai. She was a feminist socialist leader who had been part of the revolutionary movement for years, and she wrote about the events of that morning with a precision that no one who was further away from it could match. The February Revolution began on that day, she wrote, simply, without qualification. Leon Trotsky, who would later write the definitive history of the Russian Revolution, described February the 23rd in language that catches even him off guard. He admitted plainly that the demonstrations scheduled for International Women's Day had been planned as gatherings, not as revolution. It had not occurred to anyone, he wrote, that Women's Day could bring forth the revolution. Not to anyone. The women who started it were not following a political blueprint. They were following hunger and grief and patience that had finally quietly run out. As historian Tsuyoshi Hasegawa, who wrote the most thorough academic study of the February Revolution, put it simply, no propaganda was necessary to incite these women to action. The second day, February the 24th. More people came out, not 75,000, 200,000. The movement had doubled overnight. University students joined, teachers joined, white-collar workers who had never been on a breadline in their lives but who had been watching the country crack apart for 3 years joined. By the third day, February the 25th, the strike was general. 400,000 people across the city, not just in the Viborg district anymore, not just textile workers, not just women, everybody. The Okrana, watching all of this with what must have been a certain cold professional horror, filed reports describing the demonstrations as so provocative that it was necessary to reinforce police details everywhere. The Tsar, still in Mogilev, received telegrams. Nicholas sent back orders. Restore order, he wrote. Use force if necessary. But then something happened. Something that the Tsar had not planned for, that the government had not planned for, that even the revolutionary committees had not fully expected. The soldiers did not fire. On February the 26th, the Volinsky regiment was ordered to shoot into the crowds on Znamenskaya Square. Some of them obeyed. People fell. The crowd scattered. For a few hours it looked as though the government might hold. But that night in the barracks, the soldiers of the Volinsky regiment held a meeting, and the next morning they came back out. Not to suppress the demonstrations, to join them. Here is what I want you to understand about why the soldiers chose that. The men in those regiments were not professional soldiers with years of service and distance from the civilian world. Most of them were conscripts, peasant boys from the same villages that the women in the streets had come from, brothers and neighbours and cousins of the people they were being ordered to shoot. Some of them had been standing in Petrograd for months, stationed in the city while the war ground on, and they had watched the bread lines grow and the faces in those lines get thinner, and the expressions in those eyes change from hope to something harder. And there is a documented moment reported by multiple witnesses of women in the crowds approaching lines of soldiers, not attacking them, approaching them, reaching out, taking hold of the soldiers' rifles, and saying, "Put down your bayonets, join us." Leon Trotsky wrote about this in his history. A great role is played by women workers in the relations between workers and soldiers. They go up to the cordons more boldly than men take hold of the rifles, beseech, almost command, "Put down your bayonets, join us." And one by one, or in small groups, or finally in whole regiments, the soldiers did. I want to stop for a moment and ask you something, because this is the part of the story I find myself returning to most often. Why did it work? Not the political explanation, not the material conditions and the failing economy and the exhausted army. I mean, why in that specific moment did the soldiers listen? They had orders. They had guns. They had every institutional incentive to comply with what the chain of command was telling them to do. And they chose not to, because of women asking them not to. I've read the scholarly explanations for this many times. The psychological distance between peasant soldiers and the crowds they were meant to suppress. The erosion of loyalty after years of poor treatment. The contagion of revolutionary sentiment spreading through the barracks. All of those explanations are real. All of them matter. But I keep coming back to something simpler. When a woman looks at a soldier and says quietly, "We have husbands and fathers and brothers at the front. You have mothers and wives and sisters. We're asking for bread and an end to the war." When she says that, and she means it, and he knows she means it, and the rifle is cold in his hands, and the woman in front of him has the same face as the women he grew up around, something in the mechanism of obedience simply stops working. By the end of the week, the Petrograd Soviet had been formed. The provisional government was taking shape. Nicholas's generals were sending him telegrams recommending abdication. 5 days, that is all it took. From the morning of February the 23rd, when women threw snowballs at factory windows, to the collapse of 304 years of Romanov rule, 5 days. Now, here is the thing about this story that has bothered me for years, and I suspect it might bother you too once you hear it. After the revolution, when the Soviet government began constructing its official history, deciding which events mattered, which dates to commemorate which people to center, something quietly happened to this story. The women's role in starting the February Revolution was minimized. February the 27th. The day the provisional government formed, the day the soldiers fully mutinied, was declared the day of the revolution. Not February the 23rd, not the day the women walked out. The women's demonstrations were described repeatedly in official accounts as spontaneous, as backward, as unskilled, as if the people who actually started the revolution were a footnote to the revolution they started. The men in the revolutionary parties, including Kayurov, who had told the women not to strike the night before, and spent the next several days trying to catch up to what they had set in motion, were centered. The women were moved to the margins. It is one of the more remarkable acts of historical erasure in modern memory, and it matters. Because if you want to understand what actually happened in those 5 days in February of 1917, you have to start where it actually started. Not with a manifesto, not with a party congress, not with a speech, with women, cold, hungry, done waiting, throwing snowballs through windows. The empire that had survived invasions, famines, wars and revolutions for 3 centuries could not survive that. Not when the soldiers would not shoot. Not when the snowballs kept coming. Not when the woman at the front of the crowd took hold of a rifle barrel with both hands and refused to let go. 5 days after International Women's Day of 1917, a train was stopped on its tracks. A man was told that the world he'd been born into was gone. He signed his name on a piece of paper, and the question of what happened on that train on that night, in that moment of absolute silence, when the pen came down on the page, is exactly where we're going next. The Cossacks were supposed to be the most reliable instrument of order in the Tsar's arsenal. For generations that had been their role. The Cossack cavalry, recruited from the southern grasslands, trained in mounted warfare armed with whips and sabres and carbines, had been the force Nicholas could deploy when everything else was not quite enough. In 1905, during the failed First Revolution, they had charged through crowds wielding those whips. People remembered the sound of it. People remembered what it meant to see Cossack horses at the end of a street. So on the morning of February the 23rd, 1917, when the crowds began moving through the streets of the Vyborg district and spilling toward the bridges, the authorities deployed the Cossacks. Standard procedure. expected outcome, except something happened that was not in the script. The Cossacks charged. They charged repeatedly. But as Leon Trotsky recorded it, and he was watching, and he remembered every detail they charged without ferocity, the crowd parted, let the horses through, then closed up again behind them, and there was a moment, a documented specific moment, when a protester passing between the horses looked up at a Cossack, and the Cossack looked back at him and winked. That wink. I've thought about that wink more times than I can count, because it is one of those tiny gestures that contains an entire world inside it. A man on a horse in uniform carrying a weapon under orders, a man on foot in a factory coat carrying nothing, and between them a wink, which said, without any words at all, I know what is happening here. I am not going to stop it. Good luck. Trotsky wrote, their promise not to shoot was passed from mouth to mouth. Word travelled through the crowd faster than the horses did. The Cossacks were not with the government anymore, and everyone could feel it. Now, let me take you back one day earlier, the February the 26th, because this is where the story takes the turn that made everything after it inevitable. Nicholas had sent orders from Mogilev, clear direct orders, restore order, use whatever means necessary. The protests must stop. The military governor of Petrograd, General Kabalov, passed those orders down the chain of command, and on February the 26th some units obeyed. On Znamenskaya Square in the centre of Petrograd, soldiers fired into the crowd. People fell. The square emptied, and for a few hours, for perhaps the last time in the history of the Russian Empire, the machinery of suppression functioned as it was designed to function. Kabalov, according to accounts from that evening, believed the worst had passed. The demonstrations were spontaneous. They would run out of energy. Things would quiet down. He'd been in this business long enough to recognize the pattern. He'd not recognized that the pattern had changed. That night in the barracks of the Volinsky regiment, something was happening in the dark. The Volinsky was one of the older guard regiments, one of the units that was supposed to be reliable, and among its soldiers was a man named Timofey Kopichnikov, 25 years old, a sergeant, born in a small village in the Penza region, the son of Old Believer peasants. He had been at the Austrian front, been wounded in the hand recovered, and been assigned to the Petrograd garrison. He was not a revolutionary intellectual. He was not a Bolshevik organizer. He was a sergeant from a village. But on the night of February the 26th, he gathered 18 of the most trusted men in his company in what the historical accounts describe as a dark, out-of-the-way corner of the barracks, and they talked. Not long, not with speeches. 18 men in a dark corner speaking quietly, and what they resolved in that corner was simple. Tomorrow they would not do what they had been ordered to do. Sergeant Kopichnikov gave instructions. The company was supposed to form at 7 in the morning. He told them to be ready at 6 instead, and to spend the hours between then and dawn talking to the rest of the company, quietly, one man at a time, explaining what they had decided, asking who else would make the same choice. When dawn came, the company of 350 men was already assembled. Their commanding officer, Vice Captain Lashkevich, arrived to lead them out to suppress the demonstrations. He read the orders, and the company stood there and did not move. Lashkevich tried again. There is an account of what happened next that I find almost impossible to fully absorb. Kopichnikov stepped forward. There was a moment of direct confrontation between the officer and the sergeant. Lashkevich turned and walked toward the gate, and then in a chaos of those seconds that happened too fast for anyone present to fully reconstruct afterward, the officer was shot. The other officers fled. They grabbed the regimental standard and the treasury and ran, and the company of 350 men emerged into the courtyard. Kopichnikov fired a volley into the air as a signal. The guardroom was opened. The prisoners inside were freed. Delegates ran to the neighbouring companies. The Volinsky regiment was in mutiny. What happened next moved with a speed that no one, not the government, not the revolutionaries, not even Kapitchnikov himself had predicted. Within hours, the mutiny had spread from the Volinsky to the Semyonovsky regiment, then to the Moskovsky regiment, then to the Izmailovsky regiment. And then, and this is the detail that I think carries the most historical weight of all of them, to the Preobrazhensky regiment. The Preobrazhensky, the oldest regiment in the Imperial Guard, founded by Peter the Great himself in the 1680s when he was still a teenager, building what he called his toy army in the fields outside Moscow. The regiment that had been at the core of Russian military power for more than 2 centuries, that regiment joined the mutiny. When the Preobrazhensky went, it was not just soldiers defecting from the Tsar. It was history itself turning its back. By noon on February the 27th, the mutinying soldiers had reached the arsenal. The arsenal was taken. 40,000 rifles were distributed to the crowds in roughly 1 hour. 40,000 in an hour. Then the Peter and Paul Fortress, the massive star-shaped stronghold on an island in the Neva, the oldest building in Petrograd, the place where Imperial Russia had imprisoned its dissidents for 2 centuries, fell to the insurgents by midday. The Ministry of the Interior was set on fire. Police headquarters was stormed. Political prisoners who had been waiting in cells were freed, blinking into the winter sunlight. By nightfall on February the 27th, 60,000 soldiers had joined the revolution. Not deserted, not run away, joined. They were marching in the streets alongside the workers who had started all of this 4 days earlier, chanting 2 things: down with autocracy, down with the war. Let me pause for a moment and talk about something that historians of this period have wrestled with for a long time. Why did it happen so differently in 1917 than it had in 1905? In 1905, there had also been widespread protests, strikes, demonstrations. In 1905, soldiers had also been asked to suppress crowds. But in 1905, they had done it. Not entirely, not without internal resistance, not without eventually forcing limited reforms. But the Romanov regime had survived. Why not this time? There are several answers, and all of them matter. The first is the war itself. By February of 1917, the Russian army had been fighting for 2.5 years. Over 2 million soldiers had been killed in combat. The men in the Petrograd garrison were not battle-hardened professionals. They were exhausted conscripts, many of them veterans of the front who'd been cycling through the capital, on recovery assignments, carrying in their bodies the accumulated weight of what they had witnessed. Historian Tony Ashworth studied the psychology of those soldiers and found something important: the tactical habits they had developed in the trenches, what he called tacit affirmations, the informal agreements soldiers made with each other not to fight unnecessarily. The collective instinct for self-preservation had carried over from the front to the capital. Firing over the heads of protesters, it turned out, was not so different from firing over the heads of enemy soldiers when no one really wanted to die. The second answer is simpler and more human. 90% of the officers in the Petrograd reserve units had been commissioned during the war. Not career officers, not men who had spent years building relationships with their soldiers. Recently commissioned men, many of whom had little combat experience and little personal bond with the troops they commanded. When the moment of testing came, when the order to fire was given, and the soldiers hesitated, there was no deep reserve of loyalty or shared history to draw on. Just an order and a crowd and a choice. I want to tell you about one more moment. Because among all the crowds and regiments and 40,000 rifles, there is a specific, small, perfectly observed moment that I think captures what was actually happening better than any of the statistics. It was reported by multiple witnesses on the Nevsky Prospect. A column of demonstrators was moving through the boulevard. Ahead of them, a group of soldiers stood in formation. A cordon, the standard defensive posture. The demonstrators approached. The soldiers raised their bayonets, and then this is the moment one demonstrator near the front of the crowd stopped walking and just stood there, watching. And one soldier in the line, after a long pause, slowly lowered his bayonet. Not dramatically, not with a shout or a gesture, just slowly, as if setting something down. The crowd roared, and then the crowd moved forward, and the soldiers stepped aside. Here is the thing about that moment that I keep returning to. The soldier did not lower his bayonet because he was ordered to. He was ordered not to. He did not lower it because of any theoretical argument about politics or revolution or the rights of workers. He lowered it, I think, for the same reason the Cossack winked. Because the person on the other side of that bayonet was not an enemy. They were from the same country, from the same kind of village, from the same kind of hunger. The apparatus of the Romanov state had spent 300 years maintaining the fiction that a soldier's loyalty to the Tsar was stronger than his connection to the people around him. In February of 1917, that fiction simply stopped being believed. And when a fiction stops being believed, it stops working. Immediately, completely, without anyone even having to announce that it is over, now. There is still one person in this story who has not yet had to confront what happened. He is on a train, moving toward Petrograd, or trying to. The tracks ahead of him are not clear, and in the telegraph office at the next station a message is waiting. Nicholas was about to discover that the world he had been born into, the world he had always assumed would outlast him, had already ended. He just did not know it yet. That telegram and what it said, and the silence that followed it on that cold train in the dark, is where we are going right now. On the evening of February the 27th, 1917, something happened at the Stavka in Mogilev that had never happened quite like this before. Telegrams began arriving, not the routine military communiques that General Alexeyev handled and summarized for the Tsar each morning at 11. Something different, urgent, fragmentary, each one worse than the last. The Petrograd garrison is in revolt. The government buildings are under attack. Order cannot be restored. The situation is beyond control. Nicholas, who had spent the day doing what he usually did, receiving reports, taking walks, reading, now sat with these messages in front of him, and made a decision. He would go back to Tsarskoye Selo, to his family, to Alexandra and the children who were 15 miles from a city that was apparently coming apart. That impulse not to go to Petrograd and confront the revolution, not to rush to the Stavka's war room and coordinate a response, but to go to his family, tells you almost everything you need to know about who Nicholas was. He was a husband first, a father first, an emperor somewhere after that. He boarded the Imperial train at 5 in the morning on February the 28th. He was moving north. The family was waiting. Now I want to describe the Imperial train to you because it matters. This was not a standard passenger train. The Imperial train was a travelling government headquarters, a long dark green convoy equipped with telephone lines, a telegraph office, a private study, a sleeping car, a dining car, and a salon car where formal meetings could be held. When Nicholas has been in Mogilev during the war, this train made the journey back and forth between the Stavka and Tsarskoye Selo many times. The route was well travelled, the tracks were maintained. The station masters along the way knew the distinctive silhouette of those dark green carriages. On any ordinary day the journey would have taken perhaps a day and a half. This was not an ordinary day. The first indication that something was wrong came at a station called Malaya Vishera. Nicholas's diary records it with characteristic terseness. During the night turned back from Vishera, he wrote, as Luban and Tosno turned out to be busy with the riots. Turned back. Those two words. The stations ahead were occupied. The way to Zarsko Selo was blocked by what exactly remains somewhat disputed by historians even now. One account holds that the tracks were seized by revolutionary forces. A more recent analysis suggests that the obstruction was based on the confused report of a single officer, Lieutenant Gerliak, who may have been mistaken about what he saw or may not have been, and that the decision to reroute the train was made based on incomplete information. What is certain is this. Nicholas's train turned around, and he lost contact with his capital, because the telegraph connection that kept the train linked to Petrograd was interrupted during the rerouting. For several critical hours, the last Tsar of Russia was moving through the winter countryside in the dark, entirely cut off from information about what was happening to his empire, alone, in his private carriage, watching snow pass the window. The train was redirected toward Pskov, a city roughly 200 miles southwest of Petrograd, the headquarters of the Northwestern Army Front, where General Ruski commanded. Nicholas arrived in Pskov on the night of March the 1st, and here is where the story takes a turn that I find deeply uncomfortably human. Because when Nicholas's train pulled into Pskov and the Tsar stepped off to be received by the local command, General Ruski did not bow. He did not perform any of the ceremonial gestures that an arriving emperor would normally have expected. He was met by multiple accounts, without ceremony and with indifference. Ruski had already decided something, and over the course of that night he began to tell Nicholas what that was. I want to take a moment here to talk about General Ruski, because he is one of the figures in this story who gets relatively little attention, but whose role was decisive. Nikolai Vladimirovich Ruski, 62 years old, a career military man. He had served in every major conflict Russia had been involved in for the past 30 years. He was not a revolutionary. He was not a Bolshevik sympathizer. He was a conservative professional soldier who had spent his life in service to the Romanov dynasty. But by the night of March the 1st, 1917, he had decided that the dynasty could not survive, and he was not alone. That night at Alexiev's direction, a message was sent from the Stavka to all the front commanders, to all of them, every general commanding a major army on every front. The message asked essentially whether they believed the Tsar should abdicate, and the answers came back, one by one, through the night, each general, when given the choice, recommending that Nicholas step down, not because they hated him, not because they were revolutionaries, because every single one of them had concluded in their professional military judgment that the only way to keep the army fighting and prevent total collapse was to remove the man whose name was now synonymous with failure. In his diary, Nicholas recorded the moment he received this news with that flat factual precision he used for everything. At 2.5 hours, responses had arrived from all. The bottom line is that in order to save Russia and keep the army at the front in tranquility, I must decide on this step. I agreed. 3 words. I agreed. The most consequential 3 words in modern Russian history, written in the same measured handwriting he used to record the weather. But there is something else that happened in that carriage that the official records capture only partially. Something that changes the shape of the abdication in a way I have never been able to fully set aside. When the Duma representatives Guchkov and Shulgin arrived in Pskov on the evening of March the 2nd, they came expecting to conduct a formal abdication of Nicholas in favour of his son Alexei. That had been the plan. Alexei would become Tsar. A regent would govern until the boy came of age. The dynasty would continue technically even as its character changed. Nicholas received the 2 men. He was calm by all accounts, composed. He told them he had already made his decision, and then he said something neither of them had expected. He said, "I do not abdicate in favor of my son." Guchkov and Shulgin were confused. They asked him to reconsider. Nicholas looked at them and explained. He'd consulted the court physician about Alexei's condition. He understood now that his son would always need medical care, always require protection, always be fragile. If Alexei became Tsar Nicholas, and Alexandra would need to leave Russia, and they could not take Alexei with them. He could not leave his son in Russia. He could not be separated from his child. "I cannot even imagine leaving my son whom I love very much in Russia in full uncertainty," he said. So instead, he named his brother Grand Duke Michael as his successor and signed the document. Let me sit with that for a moment, because this is not the decision of a cold politician calculating the angles. This is a father who, in the single most consequential decision of his life, a decision affecting millions of people, a decision that would echo through the entire 20th century, made the choice based on not wanting to be separated from his sick child. You can call that irresponsible. You can call it naive. You can call it a failure of duty, and depending on your view of what Nicholas owed to Russia versus what he owed to his family, you might be right on all three counts. But there is no reading of that moment that does not also find in it something heartbreakingly recognizably human. The empire on one side of the scale, a 12-year-old boy who cannot stop bleeding on the other, and a father who chose the boy. The abdication document was signed at 3:05 in the afternoon, on March the 2nd, 1917, in the salon car of the Imperial train at the Pskov railway station. The plaque that was installed at that station in 1997 reads simply, "On March the 2nd, 1917 at 3:05 in the afternoon, in the salon car of the Tsar's train at the Pskov station, Emperor Nicholas II abdicated the throne of the Russian state." 3:05 in the afternoon. The precision of that time is somehow one of the most moving things I know about this story. There was a before, and then at 3:05 there was an after. 304 years of Romanov rule ended in the afternoon, on a train, in a provincial city. At midnight, Nicholas boarded the train to return to Mogilev. He had to go back, there were protocols, there was a farewell address to the army still to be made. He wrote in his diary that night. The entry is short. "At 1 in the morning I left Pskov with a heavy feeling about all I had experienced." And then the sentence that has been quoted more than anything else he ever wrote. The sentence that the historians point to as the most unguarded moment in all his 51 diaries. "All around is betrayal, cowardice, and deceit." In Russian it is even shorter. 4 words. Krugom izmena I trusость I obman. All around betrayal, cowardice, deceit. I do not think this sentence was written by a man feeling sorry for himself. I think it was written by a man who had just discovered that the people he had trusted most, his generals, the men who had sworn oaths to him, the commanders of the armies he had gone to Mogilev to lead, had looked at the situation and made a calculation. And the calculation did not include him. What I find so painful about that sentence is not the betrayal. It is the surprise. The fact that he was surprised. That even in the final days of February 1917, after everything after the breadlines, the Bolshevik pamphlets, the Okhrana reports, the Duma speeches, the soldiers who would not fire Nicholas had not quite believed it would come to this. He had always assumed somewhere deep and unexamined that the thing would hold, that Avos, that Russian shrug at fate would carry him through. It did not. There is a small private scene that occurred the morning after the abdication that I think is worth closing on. Nicholas returned to Mogilev. He still had to issue his final address to the army. He still had obligations to fulfill. And on the morning of March the 4th, after all of it, after the signing, after the train ride back, after the sleepless night with the diary, Nicholas met with his mother. The Dowager Empress Maria Feodorovna had travelled to Mogilev from Kiev when she heard the news. They sat together for a long time. What was said between them was not recorded. Pierre Gilliard, who was still at Tsarskoye Selo at the time, and heard accounts of it later, recorded only that the meeting between mother and son lasted for a long time, and that both of them wept. A mother, a son, a dynasty, ending in a conversation that no one else was allowed to hear. His farewell address to the army was issued the following day. He wrote it himself. Nobody ghost-wrote it. Nobody edited it. It contained no self-pity, no bitterness, no recriminations. It asked the soldiers to be loyal to Russia, to fight for the country, to support the new government. It ended with the words, "May the Lord God help Russia." Simple, unadorned. The last official act of the last Tsar of all the Russias. And then on March the 9th, Nicholas boarded the train once more, this time not as emperor. He travelled to Tsarskoye Selo, to the Alexander Palace, to the East Wing with the warm wallpaper and the army cots and the photographs on every wall, where his wife was waiting, and his children were lying sick in their beds running fevers. He walked upstairs, he held his family, and the door closed. What happened next inside those palace walls during those last months of a life together that had been sealed off from everything else is where we go now. The last spring, the last summer, the last quiet days of the Romanovs, before the train that would take them to Siberia. The gate of the Alexander Palace opened. A motor car came through. The sentry called out in a loud voice, "Who is there?" The answer that came back was not His Imperial Majesty Emperor and Autocrat of all the Russias. It was two words, Nicholas Romanov, and the officer at the gate said simply, "Let him pass." That exchange took place on March the 22nd, 1917, 13 days after the abdication. The man who stepped out of that motor car and walked up the steps of his family home was not addressed as Tsar or Emperor or Your Majesty. He was Colonel Romanov, and the palace he was entering, the place where his children had been born, where his wife had pressed flowers and written letters, where the walls were covered with photographs, was now surrounded by soldiers who had been given instructions to watch him. Not serve him, watch him. I want to tell you about the spring that followed, because it is one of the most quietly devastating things in this entire story. And it is also, and I mean this genuinely, one of the most unexpectedly tender. When Nicholas arrived at Tsarskoye Selo that March morning, the children were sick in their beds. Olga and Alexei and Tatiana all had measles, running fevers, lying in dark rooms because the light hurt their eyes. Alexandra had been nursing them alone through all of the revolution's chaos, managing the illnesses, recording temperatures in her diary, sending nervous letters to Nicholas at Pskov, trying not to let the children understand how close everything was to collapsing. On the day of the abdication itself, Alexandra had written to Nicholas with a detail so specific that it has never left me. "The children lie quiet in the dark," she wrote. "The lift does not work. A pipe burst. Olga has a temperature of 37.7. Tatiana 38.9 and her ear begins to ache. Anastasia 37.2. That letter. Written on the same day that Nicholas was signing away 300 years of dynasty in a train carriage. She was upstairs in the palace recording ear infections. He was in Pskov recording the death of an empire. Now. When Nicholas came home and the door closed, something happened that nobody had quite prepared the provisional government for. The family simply continued. Not as emperors, not as rulers, as a family. Nicholas, who had never in his life been allowed to do manual labour, discovered that he genuinely enjoyed it. He chopped wood every day, for hours, with visible satisfaction. There are photographs of him in the Alexander Park in the spring of 1917, sleeves rolled up, axe in hand, stacking logs in neat piles. He looks in those photographs more relaxed than in almost any image from his entire reign. The provisional government had allowed the family to use a small section of the park. They were not permitted to cross the bridge that led to the larger grounds. Soldiers watched from the perimeter, but within their allotted space the family built a kitchen garden. They dug beds, they planted vegetables, they sawed branches, they cleared snow from the paths. Pierre Gilliard, who was still with the family, wrote about this period in his memoirs. The Empress and her daughters, he noted, were never idle. During their free time they sewed embroidered wove. During walks everyone except Alexandra, who was often unwell, joined in the physical work. They stored firewood for the coming winter. They cut ice from the ponds for the cellar. A family of 7 who had never needed to do any of this, learning to do all of it. Quietly, without complaint. Here is the detail that I think about most often from this period. Nicholas was told when he arrived home that he would be addressed by the guards as Colonel Romanov. Not Tsar, not Sire, not Your Majesty. And by multiple accounts, Nicholas accepted this with what Pierre Gilliard described as extraordinary serenity and moral grandeur. No outbursts, no protests, no wounded dignity. He simply replied to Colonel Romanov when someone called it. In exile, many years later, Gilliard wrote, "No word of reproach ever passed his lips." Now I have thought about that for a long time, and what strikes me is this. There is a version of Nicholas in which his calmness here looks like resignation, like a man so disconnected from the weight of events that he does not fully understand what has happened to him. But there is another version in which it looks like character, like a man who had finally, in losing everything, arrived at something. Not power, not ceremony, not the relentless pressure of being the last absolute ruler of a crumbling empire, just his family, just the garden, just the wood waiting to be chopped. I'm not sure which version is true. Maybe both are. Let me tell you about what was happening outside the palace gates during this same spring, because the world was not standing still while Nicholas chopped wood. The provisional government, the body that had replaced the monarchy, was struggling with exactly the problems that had brought down the monarchy in the first place. The war, the food shortages, the exhausted soldiers. And in April of 1917, something happened that would change everything. A sealed train arrived at the Finland station in Petrograd. On it, Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. He'd been living in exile in Zurich, Switzerland. The German government, which had decided that Lenin's presence in Russia would cause maximum disruption to the war effort, had arranged for him to travel through Germany in a specially sealed carriage. It was the kind of political gamble that looks brilliantly cynical in retrospect. The Germans wanted Russia destabilized. Lenin wanted revolution. For a brief peculiar moment their interests aligned. Lenin arrived at the Finland station on April the 3rd. He was met by an ecstatic crowd. He had been outside Russia for years. He stepped off that train and within hours was delivering speeches that utterly dismantled the provisional government's claim to legitimacy. Back at Zarsko Selo, the family was unaware of most of this. Their contact with the outside world was severely restricted. Approved letters only. No newspapers that had not been censored. No visitors outside a tightly controlled list. Nicholas wrote in his diary during this period with the same calm domestic precision he always used. Weather, walks, time spent with the children. On one particular day that spring he recorded dug beds in the kitchen garden. The children helped. Very pleasant. That sentence. An emperor in a guarded palace gardening with his children and calling it very pleasant. I do not know what to do with that sentence except hold it carefully. There is one more element of this period that deserves its own moment. King George V of England, Nicholas's first cousin. The two men had grown up visiting each other, writing letters to each other, calling each other Nicky and Georgie. They looked so similar that photographs from their youth are sometimes mistaken for images of the same person. Both were grandsons of Queen Victoria. In March of 1917, the British government sent word to Petrograd, an offer. The Romanovs could come to Britain, asylum, safety. The provisional government agreed immediately. They wanted the family out of Russia. The Romanovs were a potential rallying point for monarchist forces, and having them in the country was a complication. The arrangement seemed settled, and then within weeks the offer was quietly withdrawn. King George had changed his mind. The reason, as historians have pieced it together, was essentially this. Britain was in the middle of a world war, Republican and socialist sentiment was rising among British workers, and having the deposed Tsar of Russia arrive on British shores might, in the king's advisers' estimation, stir up unrest that threatened the British monarchy itself. George chose his own throne over his cousin. To be fair to him, he did not know in 1917 what the alternative would turn out to be. He did not know that the alternative was a cellar in Yekaterinburg, but the choice was made and the window closed. Dr. Helen Rappaport, a historian who has written extensively about this period, called the Romanovs a political hot potato that no government wished to handle in wartime. A family, a hot potato. In August of 1917, the provisional government made its decision. The family was to be moved, not to Britain, not abroad, into the interior of Russia, to Tobolsk, a small quiet town in Siberia, far from the railway lines, far from the politics, far from anyone who might try to rescue them or use them as a symbol. On the 14th of August, in the grey pre-dawn, the family gathered in the semicircular hall of the Alexander Palace. They had packed what they could. They brought their dogs. They brought 39 members of household staff who had chosen to stay. The windows of the palace were dark. They walked out through the door they had entered as a family that March morning when Nicholas had come home as Colonel Romanov. They climbed into the cars that were waiting. They drove to the station. They did not look back, or if they did, no one wrote it down. The kitchen garden they had planted that spring was left unfinished. The wooden benches they had sat on in the afternoon light were empty. The firewood Nicholas had stacked so carefully in piles against a winter that for him would not come there sat in neat rows against the palace wall, and the photographs. All those hundreds of photographs that covered every wall in the private rooms of the East Wing, the ones that Anastasia and Nicholas had taken and printed and hung as evidence of their world, their family, their particular version of ordinary life inside extraordinary circumstances. Those stayed. When Soviet curators opened the palace as a museum in 1918, they found the rooms exactly as the family had left them. Like someone had just stepped out for a moment. Like they might be back. What happened in Tobolsk and then in Yekaterinburg in the months that followed is a story that belongs in the shadows. It is not a story about quiet days. What I want to leave you with instead is that spring in the kitchen garden, the smell of turned earth, the sound of an axe, the sight of 5 children and 2 parents doing the ordinary work of ordinary life in a space that had shrunk from the largest empire on earth to a few acres of park. Nicholas wrote once during those months of captivity, "Have I not been a prisoner all my life?" And maybe that is the truest thing he ever said about himself. Not about the revolution, not about the abdication, about what it had always felt like to be inside the role he had never asked for, carrying the weight he had never been built to carry. The garden in the end was the first place that truly felt like his. There is one final piece of this story still to come. Not about endings, about what those endings left behind, what the quiet days of Imperial Russia mean a century later to the world that was born from their collapse, what we take from these lives, what we choose to remember, and why a story this old still finds us late at night wherever we happen to be, that is where we go next. Tobolsk was a quiet town, very quiet. It sat on the Tobol River in western Siberia, surrounded by forests so dense and so old they seemed to absorb sound rather than carry it. There were no major railway lines. There was no significant industry. The nearest city of any size was hundreds of miles away. When the Romanovs arrived in August of 1917, packed into a steamship that had carried them east from Tyumen 5 days and 5 nights down the river, they were received by a town that mostly just watched them arrive. Some locals brought flowers, not as a political statement, not as a demonstration, just flowers. A small Russian gesture of welcome offered to a family of strangers coming to live in a place they had not chosen. The house they were given was called the governor's house. It was large, comfortable by any ordinary standard, and significantly smaller than anything the family had ever lived in. 13 or 14 rooms, 2 stories, a modest courtyard, a fence. They called it Freedom House, which was the official Soviet designation for it, and which was either a piece of bureaucratic irony or a piece of bureaucratic obliviousness depending on your mood when you encounter it. Freedom House, with a fence and guards and restricted movement and mail censorship. Within a couple of weeks the family settled into something that looked from the outside almost peaceful. Alexandra embroidered. She read. She painted occasionally. Nicholas sawed logs every single day with an enthusiasm that apparently became something of a local fixture. The guards would watch him work. Some of them, by accounts from the period, gradually became less hostile as the months went on. A few showed something that looked almost like warmth. Pierre Gilliard was there. Sidney Gibbes, the English tutor, was there. Lessons continued. French conjugations, English grammar, history, geography. Anastasia played with the dogs. Of course she did. And somewhere in the distance Russia was tearing itself apart. On the 7th of November 1917, October the 25th by the old Russian calendar, the Bolsheviks seized power in Petrograd. The provisional government that had been running Russia since March collapsed almost without resistance. Its ministers found themselves with almost no one willing to defend them. The Winter Palace was taken in the night. Lenin, who had arrived on that sealed train from Switzerland in April, was now in charge of the largest country on earth. When the news reached the family at Tobolsk, it arrived with the specific and terrible clarity of a door closing. The provisional government had been, whatever its failures and stumbles, at least a government that discussed things. That reasoned. That contained people who still thought in terms of law and process. The Bolsheviks thought in terms of history and class, and the Romanovs were by definition on the wrong side of both. Here is the thing about this period, the period from November of 1917 until the spring of 1918, that I find hardest to fully absorb. The family did not know what was coming, not with certainty, not the way we know it now looking back. There were rumours, there was fear. Alexandra wrote letters during this period that contain a particular quality of uncertainty, not despair exactly, but a sense of something being held very carefully, as if the wrong movement might shatter it. "All the past is a dream," she wrote in one of her letters from Tobolsk. "One keeps only tears and grateful memories. One by one all earthly things slip away." She was describing loss, but not the final loss. She still believed by most accounts that rescue was possible, that some cousin, some government, some intervention from outside would come. Nicholas apparently held the same hope, not loudly, but held it. Here is where the story becomes something that has occupied historians and philosophers and ordinary people for 100 years. The question of what could have been different. Let me offer you 4 moments, 4 forks in the road, 4 places where a different choice might have led somewhere else. The first is the simplest. 1861. Tsar Alexander II emancipated the serfs, roughly 23 million people who'd been bound to the land like property. It was a genuinely transformative reform, one of the most significant in Russian history. But he stopped there. He did not build the political infrastructure that would have made emancipation work. He did not create the courts, the land registries, the credit systems that freed farmers needed to actually function as free people. He freed the serfs, but left them without the tools to be citizens. And then he was killed by a bomb in 1881. His son, Alexander III. Nicholas's father responded to the assassination by shutting down the reform movement completely. If the Tsars had not halted reform in 1881, if they had built on emancipation instead of retreating from it, the Russia that faced 1917 might have been a different country entirely. The second fork is in the year 1905. After the failed revolution, Nicholas was forced to sign the October Manifesto, a document that created a parliament, the Duma, and granted basic civil liberties. It was the kind of document that, if honoured in good faith, might have gradually evolved Russia towards something workable. But Nicholas never fully committed to it. He saw it as a retreat forced on him by circumstance, not as a genuine transformation. He dissolved Duma when they disagreed with him. He undermined the legislature's authority repeatedly. One of his most capable ministers, Pyotr Stolypin, came close to stabilizing the situation in the years between 1905 and 1911, pushing through land reforms that might have created a stable peasant class with actual stakes in the system. Stolypin was assassinated in 1911. Nicholas did not push his reforms forward after his death. The window that opened in 1905 closed slowly a little more every year until by 1914 it was mostly shut. The third fork, 1914, the decision to enter the war. Russia had genuine reasons to feel pulled into the conflict. Serbian nationalism, Austro-Hungarian ultimatums, the web of alliances, none of it happened in a vacuum. But the war from Russia's perspective was catastrophic from the very beginning. By the end of 1914, the army was already running short of ammunition. The supply lines could barely function. The officer corps had been decimated. There is a school of historical thought, and it is not a fringe view that argues Russia in 1914 was better positioned to reform from within than to fight from without. That the pressures building inside the country might have produced change, possibly gradual and chaotic and imperfect change, but change that was survivable. The war killed that possibility, not immediately, not cleanly, but steadily and with absolute thoroughness. The fourth fork is the one that haunts me most personally. It is the simplest in physical terms and the most consequential. The year is 1917. The provisional government has just offered asylum to Britain. King George V has not yet withdrawn the offer. There is, by historian Helen Rappaport's calculation, a real window, several months during which the family could have been quietly transported, quietly settled somewhere. George chose his throne. But here is the thing about that choice that I do not think gets enough attention. George did not choose to let the family die. He chose in a moment of political calculation not to take an action whose consequences he could not foresee. He did not know in 1917 that the alternative to asylum was Yekaterinburg. He knew only that having Nicholas in Britain was politically dangerous. He made the calculation that minimized his own risk. And I think most of us, if we are honest with ourselves, recognize that calculation. We make versions of it all the time, the choice that minimizes our own exposure at the cost of someone else's safety, the choice we can live with until the day we learn what we were actually choosing between. George, by various accounts, carried the weight of it for the rest of his life. In the spring of 1918, something changed. The conditions at Tobolsk tightened sharply. The new guards were different from the old ones, less personal, more political. The allowances that had made Tobolsk tolerable, the relative freedom of movement, the access to church services, the tutors, the mild treatment began to contract. In April of 1918, Alexei had a severe hemorrhage. A coughing fit had triggered bleeding in his abdomen. He could not move. He could not be transported. So when orders came from Moscow to move the family to Yekaterinburg, the family separated. Nicholas, Alexandra and their daughter Maria went with the Bolshevik escort. Olga, Tatiana, Anastasia and Alexei, still too unwell to travel, stayed behind in Tobolsk. For several weeks, the family was split across hundreds of miles of Siberian countryside. They wrote letters to each other, coded careful letters because they knew everything was being read. In one letter from this period, the three older daughters still in Tobolsk described their life there. They spoke of praying together, of reading together, of watching spring arrive outside the window while they waited. Anastasia's last known letter, written from Tobolsk before she was finally moved to Yekaterinburg to rejoin her parents, was dated March the 25th, 1918. She wrote, "For the moment, thanks be to God we are living well. Thanks be to God." 15 years old, in exile in Siberia, separated from her parents, writing to say that things were for the moment going well. There is something I want to say about these children. Not about their deaths, not about the cellar in Yekaterinburg, which belongs to a different kind of story than the one I have been trying to tell tonight, but about their lives, about what they were. Olga, the thoughtful one who wrote poetry and had a hot temper she worked hard to control. Tatiana, the organized one who kept lists and earned the nickname the Governess. Maria, whose extraordinary kindness was the first thing everyone noticed. Anastasia, who climbed trees and tripped servants, and played theatrical scenes with genuine talent, and asked about a bad word she found in a French novel. And Alexei, who said once, "When I become Tsar, there will be no poor and unhappy people. I want everyone to be happy." These were real people, not symbols, not footnotes to a political story. Real, specific, irreplaceable people, each of them a complete world. Each of those worlds ended on a single night in July of 1918. I am not going to describe that night to you. Not because the history does not matter, it does, but because you did not come here tonight for that story. You came here for the quiet days, and the quiet days are what I want to leave you with. The kitchen garden at Tsarskoe Selo, the sound of wood being split in the cold afternoon air, Anastasia's camera clicking away at family moments nobody else thought worth recording, Nicholas at his desk in Mogilev writing about the weather, Alexandra pressing flowers in her journal, Alexei asking Gilead what a bad word meant and Gilead turning red and suggesting he ask his father, the Christmas tree in December of 1916, the last Christmas tree ever decorated in the Alexander Palace. Nobody knew that then. The candles burned down. The children went to bed. The palace was quiet. History is full of before and afters, moments that separate everything into what came before and what came after. But the quiet days, the ordinary hours, the unremarkable mornings, those are what history tends to swallow whole. And I think that is why this story, more than 100 years later, still finds us in the dark. Not because of the revolution, not because of the politics, not even because of the tragedy, because of the ordinary. Because somewhere in the quiet days of people who are long gone we recognize something we know. A family having dinner together. A father who loved his family more than his empire. A mother who would have done anything to protect her children. A boy who wanted everyone to be happy. A world that ended and took all of that with it. And the unanswerable question underneath it. All the question that every quiet day contains for every person who has ever lived inside one. Did we understand what we had while we had it? The answer for the Romanovs was yes. That much I believe. For all their failures of governance and judgment and historical timing, and there were many and they mattered enormously, the family inside that palace knew exactly what they valued most. Each other. And that in the long accounting of a dynasty that lasted 304 years may be the only thing that was entirely right. There is still one piece of this story left, not the Romanovs, but what came after, what their world's ending made possible, what the world that was born from the wreckage of 1917 became, and what it still means a century later in a world shaped profoundly by the thing that happened when the quiet days ended. That is where we go next. In September of 1977, a demolition crew arrived at an address in the Soviet city of Sverdlovsk. The building they'd been sent to destroy was a 2-story house on a hill, unremarkable from the outside. Yellow walls, a courtyard. The work order had come from the very top from the Politburo in Moscow, signed off by KGB chairman Yuri Andropov himself. The official reason given was that the building lacked sufficient historical significance. There is a certain dark comedy in that phrase when you know what had happened inside those walls 59 years earlier. The Ipatiev house was demolished in 2 days. The man who oversaw the operation was a local party official named Boris Yeltsin. He would later write in his memoirs, "Sooner or later we will be ashamed of this piece of barbarism." He was right. And the irony is that destroying the building did not erase the memory of what happened there. It intensified it. I want to spend this final chapter not on the Romanovs specifically, but on the long, strange, still unfinished story of what their world's ending left behind. Because 1917 was not just the end of one dynasty, it was the beginning of a century. And understanding what that century was, what it cost, what it created, what it left unresolved, requires going back to those quiet days we have spent so much time with and asking what they meant in the longest view. Let me start with the diaspora. When Imperial Russia collapsed, it did not simply change governments, it scattered. Between 1917 and the consolidation of Soviet power in the early 1920s, somewhere between 1 and 2 million Russians fled. Aristocrats, officers, artists, writers, musicians, intellectuals, ordinary people who had built lives under the old system and could see with terrifying clarity that those lives were over. The largest concentration of them ended up in Paris. 50,000 Russians roughly settled in France. And here is the astonishing thing about what happened next. These people stripped of their country, their properties, their status, their language as a daily currency of exchange did not simply survive in Paris. They created something. Sergei Rachmaninoff, one of the greatest composers of the 20th century, had left Russia in 1917 with almost nothing. He spent the next 26 years giving concerts across the United States and Europe, supporting other exiled Russian artists through an organization he funded himself. He composed only 6 new works in that entire period. The homesickness was so profound that it effectively quieted the music inside him. But those 6 works include some of the most beautiful music ever written. The Rhapsody on a theme of Paganini, his 3rd symphony, music that carries, if you listen carefully enough, the specific weight of loving something you can never go back to. Vladimir Nabokov left Russia in 1919 when he was 20 years old. He would not return for the rest of his life. He wrote in Russian for decades, carrying the language inside him like a country in a suitcase. Then eventually he switched to English and became one of the most celebrated English language writers of the century. Lolita, Pale Fire, Speak Memory, his memoir, whose title alone tells you everything about what it meant to be that kind of exile. The Russian émigrés in Paris called themselves Russia abroad. They genuinely believed for years, for decades, that they were keeping the real Russia alive in their cafes and newspapers, and theatres and arguments waiting for the day when they could bring it home. That day never came. But what they created in the meantime became part of the world's cultural inheritance. Former princes driving taxicabs, former generals teaching children to dance, the entire first generation of what would become the Ballet Russe, performing to packed houses in Monte Carlo and London and New York. A world ended, and its inhabitants carried pieces of it out into the world and planted them in foreign soil. And some of those pieces grew into extraordinary things. Back in Russia, something very different was growing. The Soviet state that Lenin built and that Stalin later transformed into something far more brutal than even Lenin had intended lasted for 74 years. Think about that number. 74 years. People who were born under Imperial Russia, who had memories of the Romanov world, lived long enough to see the Soviet state reach its full terrible maturity and begin finally to crack. The Cold War divided the world into two camps for nearly half a century. The shadow of 1917 fell across Korea, Vietnam, Cuba, Angola, Afghanistan, across every political argument in the West about labour and capital and the proper role of government. The women who threw snowballs at factory windows on International Women's Day of 1917 could not have imagined what their morning set in motion now. Here is the question that I have been thinking about since the beginning of this story. What was actually lost when the quiet days ended? Not the empire, not the autocracy, not the hereditary monarchy which had already exhausted its ability to function. Those things were by 1917 so damaged that their loss was perhaps inevitable, regardless of who or what delivered the final blow. What was lost was something less politically defined and harder to name, a particular texture of life, the specific combination of things that existed in that particular time and place, and could not survive being transplanted, not to Paris, not to London, not to anywhere else. The bells of the Russian Orthodox churches, the smell of birch wood burning, the particular quality of light on the Neva River in the white nights of June when the sun does not fully set and the city exists in a kind of amber suspension. The way a Russian household organized itself around the samovar, that enormous, endlessly heated urn of tea that sat at the center of family life and around which every significant conversation eventually happened. The particular Russian literary tradition rooted in Tolstoy and Dostoevsky and Chekhov that produced the greatest novels of the 19th century and would have kept producing extraordinary work and did in exile but differently. The Fabergé eggs. Let me tell you quickly about the Fabergé eggs because they are a perfect symbol of everything. Carl Fabergé was a jeweller. Between 1885 and 1917, he created 50 of his famous jewelled Easter eggs for the Romanov family, each one a miniature marvel of craft and beauty, each one containing a surprise inside. Tiny golden trains, miniature portraits, a model of the Imperial yacht. After 1917, the eggs were confiscated, scattered, sold off by the Soviet government for hard currency. Many ended up in private collections around the world. Some were lost entirely. Today, each surviving egg is worth tens of millions of dollars, and people travel from everywhere to see them. Not because of their monetary value, but because they carry sealed inside their enameled surfaces a specific and irretrievable beauty from a world that no longer exists. The Ipatiev house was demolished in 1977, but it turned out that you cannot demolish memory. In 1979, just 2 years after the demolition, 2 amateur researchers quietly located the shallow grave in the forest outside Yekaterinburg where the family's remains had been hidden. They removed 3 skulls carefully, then reburied them. They could find no laboratory willing to examine them in secret, so they reburied the skulls and waited. The identities of the remains were confirmed by DNA analysis in 1994. In July of 1998, 80 years after the deaths, the remains of Nicholas Alexandra and 3 of their daughters were reinterred in a state funeral in the Peter and Paul Cathedral in St. Petersburg, the same cathedral where Peter the Great is buried, where Catherine the Great is buried, where generations of Romanovs had been laid to rest over 3 centuries. Boris Yeltsin, who as a young party official had overseen the demolition of the house where they died, attended the funeral. He stood at the tomb and said, "We are all guilty." In the year 2000, the Russian Orthodox Church canonized Nicholas and Alexandra and all 5 children as passion bearers, saints, not because they were effective rulers or wise politicians, but because of what the Church called their humbleness, patience, and meekness during imprisonment, for the way they faced what was coming without, by all accounts, breaking into bitterness or vengeance or the theatrical despair you might expect. They faced it as a family, together, in faith. Whatever your views on organized religion or Russian politics or the moral weight of the Romanov dynasty's many failures, there is something in that image that the historical record supports fully. A family at the end of everything choosing each other. I want to tell you something before we close. Today on the site of the Ipatiev house in Yekaterinburg there is a church. The Church on the Blood it is called. Construction began in the year 2000. It was consecrated in 2003. Its altar stands directly over the room where the family was killed. Every year on the night of July the 16th to the 17th, tens of thousands of people gather in Yekaterinburg and walk through the night to the church, a candlelit procession, through the summer dark, to the spot where a century ago a dynasty ended and a century began. Some of them come for religious reasons, some for political ones, some I suspect for reasons that are harder to articulate, because there is something in this story in its particular combination of grandeur and ordinariness, of historical catastrophe, and domestic love of impossible circumstances, and ordinary human choices that refuses to stay in the past. It keeps finding us. It found you tonight. And I genuinely mean that. I have spent hours and hours with this story over many years of research and writing and rereading, and it still catches me off guard. The image of Nicholas walking in the pine forest with a cigarette, Alexandra pressing flowers, Anastasia climbing trees, Alexei saying he wanted everyone to be happy, the bread lines, the women with snowballs, the Cossacks wink, the word krugom all around in Nicholas's last diary entry. These things carry weight, not because they belong to history, but because they belong to the same world you and I live in, a world where ordinary people make impossible choices, where patience and love and courage sometimes change history and sometimes do not change anything at all, where empires end and families continue, where what we care about most is rarely what the history books record. You have spent a long time with me tonight. We travelled through the frozen streets of Petrograd in January of 1917. We sat in the east wing of the Alexander Palace, where the children slept on army cots. We listened to the snowballs hit the factory windows. We stood on the platform of a railway station in Pskov at 3:05 in the afternoon, while the last Tsar of Russia signed his name. We watched a kitchen garden grow unfinished under a spring sky that had no idea what was coming. I am deeply, genuinely grateful you came along. If this story moved you tonight, if there was a detail that caught in your chest a moment, that made you think a question, it left you sitting with, I would love to know. Leave it in the comments below, even if it is just a single line, even if it is just, I heard you. That means something. And if you're listening to this in the dark, which I hope you'll let the weight of it settle gently, let it be the last thing before sleep, because the best stories do not leave you tense. They leave you quietly a little more alive. Good night, and thank you, from wherever you are tonight listening. One last story waits. It is a different world, a different century, a different empire, but the same questions are underneath it. Who holds power and why? What ordinary people do when extraordinary things arrive without warning, and what a quiet day is worth when you finally understand that nothing lasts forever. Stay close.